you for joining in the 61st consecutive Alabama Extension Cotton Scouting School. I think we've got a good group lined up today with different agents and specialists across the state to kind of give you an update on what we've seen so far this year, what we need to be looking for, and what's next. So first, I'm going to let Dr. Ron Smith kind of give a little introduction and talk about the history of the Scout School and cotton extension entomology.
Can I do it from here then? Okay. All right. As Scott said, this is our 61st year of conducting the program. We never realized that we might be doing it by Zoom on the 61st year. It's so much more fun being out there in front of the folks that are attending our school, but we'll do the best we can. This is probably the longest consecutive running extension program we have at Auburn here. But just a little bit, and from my perspective, I attended the scouting school in 1963 and then came back and have kind of been responsible for it for the last 48 years, or this is the 48th season. So with those comments, we'll get right back into the program if Dr. Graham would like. And let me just say that we're so happy to be turning over the program to Dr. Graham. He is going to be great. We've been out in a lot of fields and seen a lot of things this year already, but it's going to be in great hands down the road.
All right, so we'll start off with a little thing. So applying for points, we are able to get pesticide recertification points and certified crop advisor points with this meeting. So that's good. We appreciate the folks with Alabama Department of Ag and the certified crop advisors for working with us and providing these credits for everybody through this Zoom meeting. So you do have to watch live. So we're recording this presentation and we'll post it on the website later for people who weren't able to watch. But in order to get credits, you must watch live for the entire time. So we'll be kind of watching and making sure folks are staying logged in and things like that. So you see there, just if you need the pesticide points, email your full name, home address, date of birth, last four of your social, and your certification number to me. I've got the sheets, and I'll go in and fill them in and send them in to who they need to go to. And then for the certified crop advisors, just send in your full name and your CCA number. If you're tech savvy, you should be able to pull up your phone and scan that barcode there, open up your camera, and it should take you to a list to sign you up. I haven't tried it, but that should be able to do. So I'll give just a second for people to try that if they want to before we get into the rest of the program. And one other thing I'll note, if you have any questions during the presentation, I've got the chat pulled up on my computer here, so you can just type in a question, and we'll kind of be monitoring that throughout the process. And we can ask any questions or relay any comments that you may have about the presentations. So with that, we'll start off talking about some of the cotton insects. This would kind of be a split presentation between myself and Dr. Smith. We'll be talking about a lot of the key insect pests that we plan, or not that we plan, but that we typically find and deal with in Alabama cotton fields. So one of the first things, really the most important thing about a good cotton scout, cotton consultant is, you got to have the tools of the trade. And that, involves everything from a sweep net to a sunblock and a good hat to protect yourself from the sun. So what we've got here is a drop cloth that's 3 feet by 2.5 feet and a 15-inch sweep net. And these are important to have because most of our thresholds are based on either number of insects per row foot or per a set of sweep net samples. So really, in order to really be able to implement the thresholds that our research recommends using for making applications, it's important to have these tools You can get them from websites like Great Lakes IPM, BioQuip. There's several different ways you can get these sampling tools. A hand lens is good when you're looking at things like aphids or spider mites or silverleaf whiteflies. It's very helpful to have one of those little hand lenses to help you zoom in on the leaves. The cotton insect infestation report is another key thing. Record holding is very important. Understanding what you're looking at and recording what you're seeing in the field. I know for me anyway, I have to write down bug numbers about as soon as I see them, or I'll forget them. I start thinking about football or what I'm going to eat for supper or something like that, get distracted. So it's very important that we keep good notes, good records, comments of, growth stage of the crop, things like that. Then also, it's hot and only getting hotter. Alabama's a pretty warm state, and the few months that I've lived here, it's getting really hot on us. So it's important that we have sunscreen, we have, hats to protect our ears and the back of our neck, water, stay hydrated out there, and make sure that we're communicating and somebody knows where we are if we're out by ourselves, and kind of knows to check in on us from time to time and make sure we're doing okay. So with that, there are a lot of different bugs that we can see in a cotton field at any given time, and so it's important to kind of have an idea of what we're looking for at different timings, so we're not getting distracted by all the different insects that we may or may not see. Aaron, yes, I'll provide some links for that later. So really, from emergence through the seedling stage, we're primarily thrips are our main insect pests. This year, we saw a lot of grasshoppers and snails and slugs, things like that. So that's kind of what we're looking for through the first 28 days or so of the season. Once we start to square at that point, we're going to really be focusing on plant bugs. Spider mites and aphids can really show up at any point in time during this, but around first square, plant bugs are what we're really sampling for, and then we're looking for things like spider mites. We're looking for things like white flies and aphids as we're going through the field and scouting. Moving into bloom, plant bugs can still be an issue, but that's when your bollworms and stink bugs start to show up, and those stink bugs in particular are really kind of our key insect pest in the state of Alabama. And Dr. Smith is going to talk about stink bug management later in the presentation. Then again, things like aphids, whiteflies, spider mites that tend to be kind of driven by weather. May be found at any time during the season, so it's something that we're not always necessarily intentionally scouting for, but we should always be observing. Every time we're in a cotton field, we should be observing and looking around for signs of injury and the presence of these insects. So I don't want to spend just a whole lot of time talking about some of these pests that are already past us for this year, but hopefully there's going to be a next year, and we need to be thinking about it. So thrips, as I said, are our primary pest of seedling cotton. They're really our most important one, consistently year in and year out. And it is thrips. There we have 1 thrips. We have 100 thrips. I don't know why that S is a constant there, but it is. We're dealing with complex of species: tobacco thrips, flower thrips, soybean thrips, onion thrips. There's a lot of them. We're primarily the tobacco thrips is what we're concerned with. That's the one that makes up the majority of our complex, and is the one that's starting to develop resistance in some issues. The injury can be caused by both adults and immatures. They'll cause an upward curling of the leaves. Sometimes you'll see a silvery sheen or some crazy cotton if they damage the terminals, where the cotton will start growing multiple main stems. In severe cases and untreated, you'll see death. Not real common unless you do research like we do and you really try to make that happen, but it can happen in fields, rare occasions. Really what we're the most concerned about with thrips is delayed maturity. You see I've got that bolded there. And, a lot of times that can be the difference, a week delay in maturity could be the difference in getting it in before, and getting your crop out of the field at the end of the year before a hurricane or something like that. So it's really important that we get a good head start on thrips management, and keep our crop vigorous and avoid any delays in maturity. So here's just some images of cotton at the 2-leaf stage. You see just a little injury there on the left, and what we would call moderate injury on the right. You can see the cupping is starting to show. The little silvery sheen is somewhat starting to appear there as well. Really not too bad of injury. When you consider this picture in particular, this is probably 4th or 5th true leaf cotton. So this is under substantial pressure here, and you can see those newly emerging leaves, or some of them are black and dead. The other ones are just barely coming out. Really very, very heavy, substantial injury there. So here's just a couple more images of various injuries, and I put the slide there. I hope you can see it on your computer screen. It may be a little small, but just to kind of give you an idea of how we rate damage. And, you may hear us from time to time talking about, we give it a rating of a 1, or we give it a rating of a 5. So this is kind of the scale of what we use. And generally, when we rate thrips injury, we expect to see delays in maturity and possibly reductions in yield based on a 3. That would be our threshold of a time when we need to make a foliar application to protect the crop from further thrips injury and delays in maturity. So I see we had a comment there about cold injury weather or wind injury and thrips injury. That's a good question, and it can be hard to tell the difference. And part of that is going to be, sampling. Do you have thrips in the field? That can give you an idea of are thrips doing this, or is it another factor? You see, we've got here that injury tends to be worse when you have poor growing conditions such as cold or herbicide injury or seedling disease. That can really exacerbate the injury and make it worse. We're primarily managing thrips with at-plant insecticides, either neonicotinoid insecticide seed treatments or in-furrow sprays of things like imidacloprid or acephate or AgLogic as a in-furrow insecticides that we're using. We have a foliar threshold when damage is evident and thrips are present. Really, in a lot of research across the cotton belt, you tend to see the highest return on an insecticide application for thrips when it's made at the first true leaf stage. And so we've got this new model that was developed at North Carolina State called the Cotton Thrips Infestation Predictor Model. I like to just call it the thrips model. It's a little bit shorter to say, but it's really a pretty neat thing. If you've tried it, you can go into this website. You just Google NCSU thrips model. You should be able to find it, or cotton tip. It shows up pretty easy on your Google. And you can go in and give it your field location. You can give it your planting date, and it'll give you a window of 5, 7, or 10 days around that planting date. And the model is looking at temperature patterns, rain patterns, things like that. And it's essentially predicting what the thrips will do moving off of wild hosts, and how quickly they'll begin to grow and lay eggs, and then immatures hatch out and feed, and when they'll move onto your cotton, and it can line that up with the susceptibility of your plant based on the weather and how fast the crop is growing. So this is really a good tool to give us an idea of what our relative thrips pressure may be like in a given area for a given planting date. And it can change, based on, we had this year a random quarter-inch of rain came through that wasn't predicted, and it changed our thrips model prediction based on that. So it's important that we look at it a couple of days before we plant, the day we plant, and then we can look at it a couple of days after too, and make sure there haven't been any big changes. And one other point about this model is it's just pulling local weather data from a given area, so you don't have to put in every field. Really probably a county level or certainly the nearest community level would be good enough to give you all the fields in that given area. So one kind of seems to, and historically it's been more of a sporadic pest, but in the last couple of years it's becoming a little bit more consistent for us is grasshoppers. So the species that we're dealing with primarily right now in our seedling crop is the differential grasshopper. They can lay their eggs anywhere from late March all the way through June. It takes them 35 to 50 days, so you can imagine you get a staggered hatch of eggs, and it takes them that long to go through. You have the potential to have grasshoppers in your field for a pretty long time. One female can lay anywhere from 25 to 150 eggs, and if you're in a field with just every time you take a step, it's like the ground's moving from grasshoppers. You can really just imagine how many immature grasshoppers may be coming. So it's something that is really something that we're trying to pin down. From talking with Dr. Smith about this in the past, it's really just because they're there doesn't mean they're gonna eat every cotton plant you got, but they very well might. So it's kind of a risk thing on when to make treatments. But here's some images of the injury that they do. It looks similar to cutworms. Sometimes they'll kind of cut the plant off in the crook while it's still pushing up, and then they'll feed on the leaves. But you'll see stems, down the row with no leaves, and you'll be jumping grasshoppers up the whole time you're walking, and that gives you a pretty good idea of what's going on in the field. So here's an image from a field this year in Alabama where the grasshopper didn't quite get that one broken all the way. You can actually see there in the shade, you can see a plant that was cut off by a grasshopper. But so this is kind of what we're looking for, these plants that are snapped off above the soil level, bent over. So what we do know about grasshoppers is they tend to be worse when we have dry winters. They tend to be worse in lighter sandy soils and then reduced or no-till situations. I think we feel pretty confident saying that if you've had a field that's had a problem with grasshoppers in the past, you're likely to have problems with grasshoppers in the future if we're in a dry winter, things like that. So, we're putting out an insecticide to burn down something like a growth regulator like a Dimlin or something like that can control these immatures can be a good way to go to really reduce the risk of getting losses of your stand from grasshoppers. So another one that's not actually an insect, so you don't get too upset with us that we don't know just a whole lot about this one since it's not an insect, but snails and slugs, they seem to be really a growing phenomenon for us. These snails, everything you read in the literature suggests that they're not actually feeding on the leaves. Most of these feed on dead tissue. But for whatever reason, they're crawling up and breaking the plants over and causing stand loss. So whether they're feeding or not really doesn't matter because at the end of the day, they do have the potential to do damage. So you notice snails obviously are different from slugs. Snails have the shell. They'll come up on the plant during the day and I guess for lack of a better term, they'll just hang out up there. Like I said, they don't appear to be feeding. I don't know if they're sucking juices from the leaves or what, but they'll be up there during the day, just hanging out and congregating together. Slugs, on the other hand, slugs will feed. Slugs will feed on leaves. You get a lot of this kind of irregularly shaped holes along the leaf margins. Slugs are one of those pests that when you come out in the morning, you don't see any damage, or in the afternoon, you don't really see any defoliation in your plants. You come back the next day and there's holes everywhere. Well, those slugs are hiding out in the soil and underneath, the leaf trash stuff during the day, and at night when it's a little bit cooler, they'll come up and feed. Snails would differentiate from slugs because they don't have a shell. They're going to be small, kind of dark brown or black, depending on what time you see them. But slugs absolutely will feed on leaves. They will cut stems similar to what you see with cutworms and things like that. So that really brings up the question of what do we do about them? They're not insects, so insecticides provide no control. There's been a lot of tests and trials and things, and nothing really seems to do anything to them. We can identify some things. We know that they tend to be worse and reduced in no-till systems. Times when you can't get the furrow closed, you can create what we call a slug highway, where they can just work down the furrow and eat seeds or eat seedling plants all the way down. There are some baits available for slugs. They've got no activity on the snails, but they contain iron phosphates or metaldehydes. The problem is they're pretty expensive and moderately effective at best. So really, I think cultural controls are going to be our best way to control slugs and snails. Getting good burn down, not planting in wet conditions, making sure that we've got the tops of the beds clean and good planting conditions, I think, are going to be probably our best way to manage these guys. So now I'll talk a little bit about aphids. We're moving into some pests that we're starting to see in fields currently. One female aphid going through the asexual reproduction can give birth to 30 to 80 immature females at one time, which are then born pregnant and can give birth in 4 to 7 days after being born. So as you can see, we can really have a lot of generations of these things pretty quick if conditions are right. These females are laying eggs. They're already pregnant and ready to lay eggs, and we can really get into some trouble in a hurry in those situations. So here's just an up close of the different forms, colors, some with wings, some without wings that you may see. You can see the cast skins where the aphids have grown, molted, and left their skin there, kind of like a snake. They'll leave those cast skins there and grow to the next size. The way that we know it's an aphid is we look at these. They're called cornicles. I've heard them described as tailpipes before, with these little spine-looking things that stick off of their rear end, and that's where the honeydew that they secrete comes from those body parts. So that's how we can make sure that we're identifying aphids using those hand lenses that I talked about at the beginning of the presentation. So thankfully, we've got some good ways, or I guess helpers out in the field, biological control agents, things like lady beetles can feed on aphids and try to keep suppressions suppressed. There's some parasitic wasps and things that will feed on mummies or feed on aphids and cause what we call aphid mummies, which is what these big tan, fat-looking aphids are. And then, of course, the aphid fungus really comes in and does a good job for us at some point in the season. We're starting to pick up some aphid fungus around the state already, so that's a good thing. Hopefully, it can help us to avoid insecticide applications. But sometimes insecticide applications are necessary for aphids, particularly when plants are drought stressed. You can see some issues with aphids. If you have heavy populations building, early or late in the season, combined with drought stress, that's a problem. If you got aphids building when when bolls are starting to open, you can get honeydew on cotton, which is something that we really want to try to avoid. But really another time that's key to maybe consider controlling aphids is if you look in the terminal of this cotton plant here, you see all these aphids. And, I don't know that I could find a bollworm egg trying to thumb through all this. It's sticky from the honeydew. There's all these aphids everywhere. It's near impossible to find a bollworm egg in a situation like this. So if we're getting near the flight, the bollworm flight, and we're finding a lot of aphids in our in terminals and things, we may consider making an application to manage aphids. But really, to scout for aphids, like I mentioned earlier, we're really just kind of walking and observing. You're looking for the honeydew on the tops of leaves, from the aphids on the leaf above it. They're dropping honeydew, or you can flip over leaves and look for the appearance of aphids as well. And our thresholds are really just kind of based on professional judgment in a way. Just, that feeling of, hey, we're getting a little drought stress, we may need to make a spray, or, you're worried about the fungus being too late to slow them down. But generally speaking, we try to wait on the fungus to make applications. So another one, spider mites. These guys are very weather driven. The incidence of spider mites, I think at some level they're probably in the field all the time, but as long as conditions don't get too hot and dry for extended periods, we generally can manage them pretty well without having to spray. Historically, if you look through the literature, spider mites begin on ditch banks, on field borders, and then move their way into the field. It seems like in recent years, that trend is kind of changing, and we're starting to see aphids, really throughout the field. They're not beginning in localized areas on field edges, and part of that's probably got to do with the move to reduced and no-till and cover crops. There's a lot of benefits with those things, but if we don't get good burn down, we've got weeds in the field that the spider mites are on. And then when our crop comes up and those weeds finally die off, or we come back and get a post-application of a herbicide, then the spider mites move on to the plants in the middle of the field, and then it gets hot and they blow up. See here, in good conditions for spider mites, they can go from egg to adult in as little as 4 or 5 days. So they can really build up quick. If you're on a weekly schedule, you can be watching a hot spot today and come back next week and they've exploded. So there's something that we really need to keep an eye on and watch for. Here's some of the symptoms, spider mites, that you'll see. Some of this white speckling on the leaves generally kind of starts along the leaf vein and works its way out. It starts out as kind of a whitish color, and as injury progresses, it will turn more of this reddish color here that you see. And we do still tend to see them as hot spots throughout the field. So you can see these red arrows are pointing at a couple of different spots where the mites came in pretty early on some seedling stage cotton and did some defoliation and things. And like I said, they can really blow up quick. A lot of times, if we get a well-timed rain, that can beat them back and help the plants to outgrow them. But there is a chance that if we turn hot again for another 7 or 10 days, they can build back up. So as I said, worse and hot, dry conditions are following, sequential applications of broad spectrum insecticides that are knocking out all the beneficials and don't have any impact on the spider mites at all. It can really make the problem worse and flare the mites. Our threshold, again, kind of requires a little bit of professional judgment. When mites are widely distributed and leaf modeling is common. So when you're seeing a lot of symptoms across multiple areas of the field, it may be time to make an application, but maybe the weatherman's telling you got a 80% chance of thunderstorms tomorrow. Well, maybe we can wait and hold off and see if that rain's enough to beat them back. But we don't want to jump the gun too early on these guys because we've got resistance building and things like that. So it's important we only make applications when we need to. So now moving into tarnished plant bugs, kind of our big pest in squaring cotton, and then a little bit into the flowering stage in Alabama before the stink bugs come in and take over the show. But so these plant bugs are going to they're going to start on weedy hosts. Fleabane is one of the main plants that they'll begin their development on. Females can lay anywhere from 50 to 150 eggs that'll hatch in 7 to 12 days, and it takes roughly 15 to 21 days for these plant bugs to go from hatchling, first instar immature, all the way to an adult. And after about 7 days, the adults can start to lay eggs themselves. The females can lay eggs themselves. So you can see these generations can really start getting going on us pretty quick, and we can run into an issue with plant bugs. So here's some images of an adult plant bug and a couple of images of immature plant bugs. The immatures, they look similar. They're just green, but they really look pretty close. On the drop cloth, sometimes you may confuse a plant bug with an aphid or something like that, but aphids are going to be very still on a drop cloth, where immature plant bugs are going to be running around and moving pretty quickly. So the kind of two key characteristics of adult plant bugs is this triangle on the top of their wings, and then these two white dots that you see the orange arrows pointing at. Those are the key characteristics of adult plant bugs. And here's just a closer view of the immature. You see it's shaped similarly. This is a later instar immature where the wing buds are beginning to form, and this one's getting close to being an adult. So, early in the season, during the squaring period, plant bugs are moving into the field when our fleabane and weeds, ditch bank weeds are drying down. Plant bugs are moving into the cotton fields, and they're doing two things. They're feeding on pinhead squares, and they're laying eggs that will soon develop into immatures that will do damage as well. So here's a couple of images. What we're looking for when we talk about square retention, we're looking for squares that have been fed on and dried down and fallen off the plant. We're looking for these abscission scars, we call them here. You can see where there should be a square there on that node. So square retention is very important for a couple of different reasons. It gives us an idea of what's going on in the field now. It can give us an idea of insecticide efficacy if we make an application for plant bugs. We're dealing with adult insects, which can move into the field over several weeks. So it gives us a good idea of what our insecticide did last week based on the square retention in the upper three nodes this week. And so that's what we like to look at is just pick randomly, look at 25, 50, 100, however many squares you need to, depending on how big your field is. Look in the upper 2 or 3 nodes for the presence or absence of squares. Sometimes, in that node in the terminal, you can do more damage thumbing through trying to find the square than the plant bugs themselves are doing. So for me, if I can't look at a terminal node and pretty easily see the square, I don't worry with it. I just go to the second and the third node, like I said, because you don't want to do more damage than good. But again, here's what we're looking for. We're either looking for abscission scars or where a missing square is. We're looking for blasted square, which is what we call these dried off squares that are there, or a flared square is also a sign of plant bug feeding. So we're keeping up with the number of missing or damaged squares compared to the total number of squares, and our threshold is based on that at 80% square retention. So here's some more images of dirty squares from plant bug feeding. but they're going in and feeding and secreting they're going to the bathroom and things like that, and kind of staining these squares up. And we see a dirty square will turn into a dirty bloom, which is what you see here. So these are more signs of plant bug injury. These flowers, you'll see all the staining and things. Often you'll see plant bugs running around, having parties in these white blooms. Sometimes if the square was damaged enough, the blooms they just won't look normal. They'll be a little bit shorter than a normal bloom will be, or look a little misshapen. And really, there's nothing we can do about a dirty bloom at this point. We don't have any thresholds based on dirty blooms, because a lot of this injury was done when it was a square, but it is an indicator of what plant bugs have done in our field. So one other plant bug, so generally speaking, we're most concerned about tarnished plant bugs, but there is another plant bug, the clouded plant bug, which seems to be making up a higher proportion of the population than I think you would normally expect. This clouded plant bug it's a little bit larger, more robust than the tarnished plant bug. The characteristics there for both the adult and the immatures are these really thick first segment of its antennae. You see right here this arrow, and then also the very pronounced hind leg is a characteristic. Same thing for the immature. You still see that very thick first segment of the antennae, and then the hind leg is very large and robust. So clouded plant bugs are generally they tend to be more prevalent in wet springs. Buttonbush is thought to be one of the important hosts for these guys. So they're developing on that and then moving it into the cotton field later. Yeah, they can do a little bit more damage than tarnished plant bugs. Are a little larger and more robust. Sometimes you'll see some of this cat facing and things on smaller bowls. There may or may not be any internal injury based on that, but that's one thing that you can see from clouded plant bugs. But as far as our thresholds and things like that, we're really considering them all to be the same from pinhead square to about the third week of square, and right around bloom. We're looking at square retention. We want to maintain at least 80% square retention. We're also looking at bugs in the sweep net of the threshold of 8 bugs per 100 sweeps. And then starting around the third week of bloom and third week of squaring, and then all the way through bloom, we're going to swap to the drop cloth as plants get a little bit larger. We start to get immatures hatching from eggs that were laid earlier in the season, and that we're primarily focusing on them. And our threshold is 3 bugs per drop at that point. So it's very important that we're out in the field with these drop cloths when we can, looking for immature plant bugs, which are really small at times, but they can really do a lot of damage. So with that, I'd like to just put in a couple of little plugs before we move on to Dr. Smith's portion of the presentation. We've got the Cotton IPM guide that's on the ACES website. You can find it. You just type in Alabama Cotton IPM guide. It shows up pretty quick. And we've got all of our thresholds in there. We've got some background information on the different insects that you may go across, as well as some beneficial insects. We've got rating scales for effectiveness of our different insecticides against the different pests that we're going against. So really a good resource that Dr. Smith has kept up for a long time, and has a lot of really good up-to-date information that's always there for your use. And I'd also like to plug our Alabama Crops Report newsletter. So a newsletter that started this year. We get a lot of updates from our extension specialists and regional folks across the state, trying to give you the most up-to-date and timely information that we can about what's going on in the field and in your area today. And then Dr. Steve Brown's got the Alabama Cotton Shorts newsletter, which is a really good newsletter, primarily focused on cotton. The Alabama Crops Report is all crops, but the Cotton Shorts newsletter is updates on cotton. That goes out about once a month. Is that right? Yeah. Monthly, the Cotton Shorts newsletter goes out. And then, Dr. Smith and I are always trying to put out timely tweets, things like that. So you can see our Twitter accounts there and our phone numbers. We're always available by, phone call, email, text, whatever. If you got something you're not sure about, please let us know. That's why we're here. And then also, I'll plug the Pest Patrol Update sponsored by Syngenta. You can text PestPad 11 to 97063 or just Google Syngenta Pest Patrol and go through and find Alabama and get good weekly updates on what's going on, what we're seeing and kind of what to do about it at that time.
So, that was a nice job by Dr. Graham. I remember my first one in 1972. I was a little bit nervous and shaky, talking to about 65 or 70 scouts at that time, and the room was packed, and I was under a lot of pressure. Anyway, good to be with you. We're going to get right into it and move as fast as we can through here. I'm going to concentrate on the caterpillars, the worms, and stink bugs with the techniques, IDs, threshold, and management. This is a chart that I like to use. I prepared the chart way back in 1985, and my purpose was to show that different pests have kind of different times of the year when they're going to be most likely at damaging levels, and the darker bars are the most likely, and the lighter bars maybe. And you'll notice we even had boll weevils and things like that in the chart. I've never updated it, but we have some new pests that could be added to it now, but it still serves a purpose. And I use this to alert scouts that there are certain times of the year that they should concentrate more on particular pests. So if you'll notice, that kind of goes through the time of the year, the month, and so forth, and the different insects. So. And the other thing I want to mention is geographically, latitude-wise, from south to north, we grow cotton over a wider area than almost any state east of Texas. If I can get a pointer here, we grow cotton from a little community of Cottonwood here in the southeast, all the way up to a community of Oakland here in Lauderdale County. If we went over here on the other corner, we grow cotton around Scottsboro and on the Sand Mountain region up in the northeast, all the way down to Grand Bay here in Mobile County, just a few miles north of the Gulf. And we've got distinct pockets of cotton, 2,000 or 3,000 acres or more, and many of those counties in between. So that's a real challenge for us to stay on top of the insects in all those areas. And that's the reason in a normal year we'd be doing 3 different scouting schools in 3 different regions, one in the north for the northern area, one in the Prattville, Montgomery area for central Alabama, and then one down in the Wiregrass for the southeastern area. And we quite often do an in-season scouting school down in the southwestern area. But today we want to start out by talking about bollworms and tobacco budworms. Now, let me go back and just say one thing. It was boll weevils that drove the cotton scouting program for many years until the weevil was eradicated in Alabama in the late 80s or particularly the early 90s. So after then, the bollworms and tobacco budworms were a dominant pest. So that's the pest that drove the scouting program. And then in 96, we moved to the genetically altered plants, and that eliminated the bollworm, the tobacco budworm totally, and the bollworm to some degree, not quite out of the system, but we did get acceptable control. Now we've lost a little ground with the bollworm species since that time with resistance to our genes. But anyway, my point is we cannot tell the difference in the color of the caterpillar between these 2 different species. We can on the adult stage, but the tobacco budworm since 1996 has really been out of the system and out of the picture on cotton. We still deal with it on some other crops. The adult stage, though, does look distinctly different. We've got the tobacco budworm on the left. It's a smaller moth, a little bit of a yellow greenish color with some bands on the wings, whitish bands. The corn earworm or the bollworm species is a darker, more buff-colored brown with some areas of bands on the back. Now, quite often we suggest that scouts at certain times of the year be looking out ahead of them as they're walking in the fields to just see the presence of some of these. They'll normally get up out in front of you a little bit and fly a few rows over, but you can get an idea of the activity of these, particularly the corn earworm or the bollworm species, as you walk through the field. Now, once these adults deposit the eggs, they go through the larval cycle, and we'll show pictures of those in just a second. But then they spend about 10 days underneath the soil as a pupal stage. So that kind of completes the life cycle. But you see the two dark areas on the bollworm on the right, the two dark spots on the wings. That's a pretty distinguishing characteristic for them. When these moths deposit the eggs, they're small, very small. They're pearly white the first morning. A lot of them are laid late at night. And if you look on them with a 10x magnifying glass, you'll see a little bit of ribbing on them, but they are definitely perfectly round in shape. Now, it takes about 3 days for this egg to hatch, and during that time, they turn a little bit more of a brownish and then a darker color right before they hatch. If this is a good point to show, you can see the developing larvae inside. The head capsule will be a little darker than the body, and you can see the ribbing on the egg itself. Now, where are these eggs in a cotton field? We're looking for a needle in a haystack, but there are certain areas of the plant that most likely going to catch or be where the egg is deposited. Now, I always like to look at the terminal first, and quite often early in the season, particularly, and up to about mid-July, a lot of the eggs are deposited in the terminals. If that's the case, I'll show you exactly what to look for on the plant if the egg's deposited in the terminal. If it's not, we'll talk about that in a few minutes, and what happens when it's down further on the plant. This is a classic position for an egg on a terminal of a cotton plant on the new unfurled leaf there. That is a great place, and it's a very fast place to look and see for the presence of eggs being deposited. You can see that in a second on a plant if you've got an egg up in that area. Now, here we move down the plant a little bit on some other leaves, and you see a multiple egg deposition there. Normally, we find one egg in a place. Right at the end of the life cycle of a moth, she may deposit more eggs in a hurry before she dies. So, or it may have been a second moth that came along, but normally one in a place. Now, if the egg was deposited in the terminal, and the little small larvae, when he hatches in 3 days, is going to start tunneling around in the new vegetative tissue there, and it's going to leave something that looks like this. So this was what we'd call a damaged terminal, a bollworm damaged terminal. Okay, if you dig around in there a little bit, you'll find the little caterpillar, kind of creamy colored body, and again, the dark head capsule is a real helpful identifying character, but he'll tunnel there for a few days and then begin to move into the next first little square, and then move down the plant in progressively older squares. So you can, if an egg was spotted in the terminal, you can kind of trail him down the plant as he ages. So that gives us a pretty wide window of opportunity to pick up on that larva, and that'll be opposed to what I'm going to show in a few minutes if the egg was deposited down in the blooming zone. Now, when the egg was in the terminal, when the larvae hatched there, and the leaf unfolds, you get a little bit of ragging like this and see the feeding damage. So that in itself, this picture here would tell me to look close in that terminal. Now, sometimes early in the season when that happens, the beneficial has already taken care of the little caterpillar, but that would allow me to encourage me to look down for a note or two and see if I can see the larvae find the larvae as he's moving down the plant. As the caterpillar moves down the plant, he's going to be damaging fruit. Here's a little small square that the worm has chewed in. You can get an idea of the size of the caterpillar by looking at the hole that he's made going into the plant. And one way, when you see this, you don't ever want to confuse this with plant bugs. Their hole is non-detectable that they're going to make as they feed on the little small square. But a bollworm is going to make the size of the hole about the size of the head capsule. Okay, as you move down the plant and they feed into a square, normally after a day or two, the bracts around the square are going to flare back, and that stands out. So just walking down a row, you can normally see then if you've got 5-day-old worms, you're beginning to see some flared squares, and that's particularly true if it was deposited in the terminal. So that would give us a clue also. Another picture here just showing about a 5-day-old caterpillar in a larger square. All right, what happens if the egg is not deposited up in the terminal? And I really think later in the season, about the time the vegetative growth of the plant slows down, the moth senses that that's not going to be a good terminal place. The terminal's not going to be a very good place for the little tiny caterpillar to feed. And so they'll put them down more closer to a small square or bloom. So here's a bollworm egg on the side of a square down the plant a ways. And other than that, they will go on down. And quite often, when the big flack comes off of corn, we get a lot of egg deposition into the blooming zone of the cotton plant, which is distinctly down from the terminal, assuming we are still not in a drought stress situation and the plant's still growing vegetatively and adding nodes. But a good thing for a scout or a field person to do is they're walking across the field. Between the time they're stopping, they can be snapping off a dried bloom here and there and just observing real close for the presence of an egg on the bloom. And it's not as easy to see after a day or two as it turns more the color of the bloom. But anyway, they can do that. And also you'd want to be looking underneath that bloom in case the little caterpillar is already hatched. They will be feeding right in the tip of the little bowl underneath the bloom. The bloom tag will still be stuck to it. So it'd be a dried bloom tag at that point. Another picture here where the egg was deposited on the bloom, and it may be on a white bloom, it could be on a red bloom. But another point to make is we get a lot of our escaped worms on our 2-gene cotton. When the egg is deposited on the bloom tags, it's a very low concentration of the BT gene in the bloom, so it gives them an opportunity to feed some on a low concentration bloom and then get inside and go in the tip of the little bowl underneath it. And that is where we find a lot of our escaped worms getting by us on the 2-gene cotton. Okay, if the caterpillar hatches on the bloom tag or even on the square bract, when they move inside, it'll be a very small little caterpillar. You can see by the point of this is a real small knife, and you see the relationship to the bloom. And again, the head capsule helps us to pick up the little caterpillar because their body is going to be somewhat the color of what they're feeding on, which would be the square there. I'm not sure how well this shows up, but this is about the way it's going to look out in the field. You're not going to have a lot to go by, but I love to look in white blooms long in time of the year when the flight's coming off of corn. We see a lot of 1- and 2-day-old worms down around the reproductive parts of the flower. And again, the body is just the same color off the background, but the little dark head capsule is a dead giveaway. And this is where a lot of our escaped worms are getting by us here. Now, I will say that here in the southeast, and particularly Alabama, we have an abundance of fire ants in the field. And fire ants are, I know, a harmful insect in a lot of environments, but in a cotton field, they may be the most beneficial insect we have because in my area, fire ants are searching white blooms every day. And I think that's one reason we've had fewer escaped worms to deal with in our system here than maybe in some other areas of the cotton belt. If a fire ant finds a small caterpillar, he's gone. There won't be a tomorrow for him. So Anyway, here's another one that developed in a bloom, and just to give you some idea, just concentrate on that mahogany brown head, and you'll find the little small worms there. So this is probably the easiest way to find small caterpillars on cotton is in the white blooms. Okay, there's a caterpillar somewhere here. It's hard to see on the screen, but I can assure you there's a little head capsule in there. And so just another example of what to look for and how close you'll have to look to find him. Eventually, they're going to become a little larger, and maybe 5 days old. You'll find them in a white bloom. We found one this week in some cotton down in southeastern Alabama about this size associated with a white bloom. Now, here's one that stayed with the bloom tag, and it's been my experience that when the egg is deposited on a bloom, they get underneath that bloom or dry red bloom and underneath the dried bloom and feed on that bowl for 5 to 7 days. So there's no other clue on the plant that there's a caterpillar out there other than that one bowl. I believe with our genetically altered cotton, the little bollworms do not like to move from fruit to fruit as well. So they stay with one fruit a lot longer than I think in the old days before we had the BT cotton. So anyway, it makes our scouting job harder, more difficult and harder. But that's the reason we want to really concentrate about mid-season, about where we're at now in mid to late July. We want to really concentrate under bloom tags. So that's where a lot of them are getting away from us. Just a classic example of how to look underneath a dry bloom on a small bowl, and they seem to always like to go into the tip of the bowl. Eventually, it becomes real ugly when they get that down lower in the larger bowls, and the feeding is bad. And that bowl, if it doesn't fall off the plant, will still be on the plant when the farmer's harvesting, and it will be a brown bowl with a big hole in it that you can see from the cap of the picker. So that's not very good for a scout, consultant, or agri-field man that's doing the monitoring when that happens. So that's what we don't want to avoid. We do want to avoid. Okay, just another classic example of a caterpillar about ready to cycle out on cotton. Now, I just want to throw this in there. There are some other eggs in cotton. Here's one, the big-eyed bug egg. It's a beneficial insect. It's an oblong egg. The yellow striped armyworm, for example, has an individual egg, but they're quite significantly larger than a bollworm egg. So there are a few other eggs, so we don't want to spray on the potential of an egg if it's a beneficial insect. Just an example, we have always said we needed to control caterpillars, the bollworm species, within the first 5 days after they hatch. So that means we've got to detect them, get the word to the grower, get the word to the applicator or the farm and the chemical supplier, and make an application when we're above threshold. So that's one of the points I want to make here. The other point I wanted to make is, even with our new chemistry, the diamides that serve to control our bollworms if the pyrethroids are no longer working, we tend to think in the old days, if we paid more for the product, it was cleanup material. Well, the diamides have to be applied at the earliest possible time after they even work best on the egg stage, when applied at the egg stage. But they're not cleanup materials, and you have to have super coverage for those. So if we get into that in the future, just know we've got to spray quick with the new chemistry and have great coverage. Okay, this is what I'm talking about that is visible from the picker seed at harvest time, and that leaves a pretty unhappy grower. Another example here. Okay, we're going to move to another level now, and this is a beet armyworm. Now, we have not had beet armyworms really in Alabama since 1995, but I have kept them in my talks at the scouting school just in case people run into them on other crops or something like that. And just this last week, we found a very uniform infestation of beet armyworms in a soybean field down in Monroe County, Alabama. Not at threshold level, but uniform at about 30 per 100 sweeps all the way across the field. So can't explain it. Beet armyworm is a dry weather pest. We've got some dry pockets, but that wasn't necessarily one of those. But don't think it had a previous insecticide, so I don't know what happened to the Cortesia wasp that normally keep this pest under control, but may have had a herbicide over the top or something, but no insecticide. Beet armyworm. All right, moving to the fall armyworm. When we just had one gene, cotton, the fall armyworm was still in the system and presented a lot of problems beginning in 1996. But when we went to the 2 gene and now to the 3 gene cotton, the fall armyworm is just totally out of the picture, I think, in cotton. But we still would like to let folks know what they look like. Inverted Y on the head capsule, and I may have not noticed it, but the distinguishing, may have not mentioned it, but the distinguishing mark on that beet armyworm was a black dot on the 4th segment behind the head capsule. But back to the fall armyworm now. We still have fall armyworms out there in the system. They're on hay, pastures, athletic fields, nice lawns, things like that. But it's a different strain of fall armyworm than what we're dealing with on cotton and corn. So they're not a problem for us at this time. Another picture of the fall armyworm, just showing the inverted Y on the head capsule. They also, when they appeared in cotton, they love to be in red blooms or get in white blooms and stay there when the bloom closes. And we would pick them up too as we snapped off the blooms as we walked across the field. Another picture of the fall here in a bloom. And this is back in the older days, this was what we'd see with fall armyworms. They'd get inside the bract on our older boughs near the bottom of the plant, and they would do some etching, and it would leave this kind of mark visible for the scout if they just bent the canopy back and looked. All right, you can see where they scaled off the inside of the bract there. And again, here's a fall. They also have a dark head capsule, but they're a little bit darker larvae. But this is where we would always find them early, either in a bloom or at the base of a large bowl. Fall armyworms come from an egg mass. Normally, we only had a few survivors out of an egg mass, and that was a little bit different. The egg mass was always low on the plant and on the bottom side of the leaf. Now, there is another armyworm, the beet armyworm we mentioned just a while ago. They also lay the eggs on the bottom side of the leaf, but when most of them survive and move away from the mass. When they do, they're scaling off the lower surface of the leaf, leaves a little telltale sign like this on the top. You normally find this around the borders of the field first, and maybe on skippy stands, a plant sitting out in a skip or something. We hope we don't get into those, and I don't anticipate getting into the beet armyworm again. But here's a classic beet armyworm here. You get a lot of survivors out of an egg mass of beet, where you only get 1 or 2 out of an egg mass of the fall armyworm. Again, typical damage from the beet armyworm, and eventually they will move to the blooms and into the bolls. Now here's the beet armyworm, I believe, here with the black dot, and I'm confusing them on my picture here now with the fall. And the fall armyworm is over the second pair of true legs with a black dot. The beet armyworm is on the 4th segment, not the 2nd segment behind the head capsule. All right, we do have, this is a yellow striped armyworm, as I mentioned earlier, a larger, fatter worm, but you'll see an occasional one, but not a pest of cotton. And then we get into the one that we're seeing in the more southern latitudes, this southern armyworm. They're big leaf feeders, and we had a lot of these with the 1 single gene cotton, but we're not seeing very many of them now with the 2 gene cotton, and particularly not with the 3 gene cotton. They do have a row of black dots about 4th segment back behind the head capsule, and they love to feed on the blooms and the foliage. Soybean loopers, I mentioned this. they're really not a cotton pest anymore. They were a significant pest back in the old days before we went to the genetically altered cotton. This is a classic pose. If you're shaking soybeans, for example, which Dr. Graham's going to cover in a few minutes, this is a classic pose for a soybean leaper. All right, let's move to stink bugs. We did a banner a few years ago, and I put it up at the scouting schools, and actually it's a little bit too big to get on the screen, but it pretty much told the whole history and how to scout and the details of scouting of stink bugs in cotton, which I consider to be our dominant pest in the coastal plains of the Southeast. And we don't talk a lot about them, but there's probably 2 million acres of cotton in the U.S. where I would consider the stink bug as the dominant insect each year, the most economically damaged insect on probably 2 million acres of cotton. Let's see if we can get some close-ups of some of those. We've got the brown stink bug in the mix and the immature stages on the left. It's interesting. The brown stink bug has a green immature stage, and I'll show you what the others look like in just a minute. But lots of times we start out the season. The brown overwinters a little bit better than the green, the southern green. And so we start out the season with more browns than we do have southern greens. But it's been my experience here in Alabama, as we move through July, for some reason the browns tend to decrease in number, and the southern green, as they begin coming out of corn, they increase in number. So from about late July on, the southern green seems to dominate our population in cotton fields in Alabama. And that's significant from one standpoint, is the southern green is easier to control with pyrethroids, or does a better job. Pyrethroids do a better job than they do on the brown. Here's our southern green. You'll notice the amateurs are the mid-size there is green with some white markings on them. And the southern green, when they first hatch, they're black with some little orange markings. And this shows them on the left here coming out of the egg mass, about 50 or so. And they tend to clump after a while, well, they clump, and then eventually they spread from there. And we've got another pest that during mild winters, we're having to contend with statewide. During our colder winters, we only get them down on the Gulf Coast area, and that's the leaf-footed bug. And you can see they got the name from the big projection there on the back legs. Now, the immature leaf-footed bugs are shown on the left. They look quite like the other. They're quite different than anything else in a cotton field, and you'll notice they are orange in color, so I'm assuming they're Auburn fans because of that. So I've always thought that. So anyway, we'll leave it at that. But anyway, in recent years, this insect is appearing all the way up to the Tennessee line. Now, the importance there, the damage is just like stink bugs, so we're going to pick up the damage while we're looking for internal injury to bolls. But the leaf-footed bug is difficult to control, and we really don't think that pyrethroids do a very adequate job on the leaf-footed bug. So at that point, if that's a big part of the mix of feeding on bolls, we have to use more of a phosphate insecticide, the biodrins or the orthines. Okay, how are we going to scout a field for stink bugs? We're going to pull a random sample of quarter diameter bolls, and that's a boll to me that's still a little spongy to the touch. We want it soft enough to where we can actually crush it between our fingers and our thumb and look for internal injury. So we're going to pull those. Now, we say to avoid field edges, but quite often the field edge will give us a misreading thing, because a lot of stink bugs, they're kind of, I term them lazy flyers. They like to sit down in the first 50 foot of a field initially. So if you want to pick them up early, I would suggest pull a sample strictly from the field borders, and then another sample further out in the field and see if they're field wide or if it's just primarily on the borders. We say 1 boll per acre and no less than 25 per field. I think that's a pretty good rule. There's a time limit on how long a field person has to burst those bolls, but I would feel real comfortable with 25 bolls from most fields. or at least from the area of the field where you're stopped at that time. If we're talking about a 300 or 400 acre field, we definitely want to pull 25 bowls from more than one side of the field. But the other thing we want to notice with when we're pulling these bowls is cotton adjacent to corn is going to have a lot more stink bugs than probably on the border adjacent to corn than anywhere else in the field. Now that's true if we're into the peanut cotton landscape, because they tend to come out of peanuts really throughout most of the season. In corn, they're going to come off when the corn's maturing down pretty much in a short window of time there. But peanuts, they tend to drift in seemingly the entire months of June and July and August. Anyway, we're going to sort the bowls in two piles. We're going to sort them in those that's got obvious external lesions, and I'll show you a picture of that in a minute. And we're going to put those in one pile, and we're going to inspect those bowls for internal injury. And I'll have some pictures here. I'll mention just a second. On the bowl wall, we're going to look for some warts. We're going to stain lint or stain seed. And if we don't reach a threshold with those bowls that already show an external injury, we're going to check the remaining bowls for internal damage. And we're going to treat then if the threshold is met for that particular week. And I consider the stink bug threshold in cotton to be the best threshold we have of any pest. Some of the best research was done, and some of the most latest research was done on stink bug of cotton. And we considered a sliding or a dynamic threshold beginning, and we like to focus on the week of bloom, and that's a real good measure of where we're at. But the first week of bloom, you don't have a lot of bowls at risk, or we can go with a 50% damage threshold with internal bowls. Moving into week 2, 30%. Then weeks 3 through about 6, 10% injury. And then as the cotton matures out, we got fewer and fewer bowls at risk. So we raise that threshold again to 30 and 50%, as we only have a few bowls in the terminal that may have time to produce. And that keeps us from spraying and getting little or no return on their investment with the spray. Let's move down in the other corner there, the right-hand corner. You see clearly the big wart there on the side of on the internal side of the bowl, and then you see the external damage on the bowl on the right with the feeding signs, the discoloration on the inside. This is a little chart that was developed by the Southeastern entomologists with basically the same information but scouting techniques, and the only thing this shows is the size of the bowl that we want to pull when we're sampling cotton. As I've sampled cotton, if you go in for a 10 or 12 day old bowl that's still a little soft to the touch, some people have a difficult time finding that bowl, but once you find where they're at on the plant, there will be 1 or 2 bowls at most that are the perfect size that week. And they'll be in about the same area of the plant, about the same node above the ground or below the terminal. So really it becomes a pretty fast thing once you kind of can figure out where they're located. Now, if you put a hand on a bowl and it's real hard and still small, there's a real good sign that a stink bug has already damaged that bowl. You can put it in your count if you'd like, but I can tell you that a high degree or a high percentage of the bowls that are real hard prematurely have been damaged internally. But the size here, once you get accustomed to the size bowl you're looking for, you don't need to measure every bowl with this little card. They're nice to have initially, but definitely don't spend all day sizing up your bowls. If they're spongy to the touch, they probably are susceptible to stink bug injury that particular week, and that's what we're focused on by that size bowl. That is the damage. What we're trying to measure is the damage that was done that week. And that's the size bowl we can pick that up in. The older bowls would be older damage. Younger bowls would probably not be attractive yet to stink bugs. Now, let's back up here. This is a Georgia publication that was prepared back in, I believe, 2017 when we got into silver leaf whitefly. and it's excellent publication. We've used it here as far as scouting technique, what the threshold is and so forth. And basically, I'm just going to highlight, if Dr. Graham would like to pitch in here, we have had some experience already this year with the silverleaf whitefly, and we're not totally cold on it. We had a pretty bad outbreak in one area of the state in 2017, but really no real problems in 2018 and 19. But it looks like we do have the potential this year of getting back into problems in the historical areas where we have had silverleaf whiteflies in the past. It's a bad pest of cotton. But anyway, they occur, the adults will be clustering in the terminals, and they deposit eggs underneath the bottom of the leaves. Those eggs hatch into immatures that are kind of like scale insects. They lock down, they're immobile, and they begin sucking honeydew, and you'll see the silvering on the honeydew shiny leaves just like we do for aphids. The key here, I think, is to detect them early. It only takes 3 or so immatures under about 50% of the leaves to be at a potentially explosive level, and 4 or 5 adults up in the terminal is going to give you a lot of eggs. It's going to be deposited in the next few days. Now, the life cycle of a whitefly is rather short, about 14 days, I believe. And the one thing I don't want to forget is when we can look for the presence of these whiteflies clustering in the terminal, but if there's very many there, you can get behind real quick. But when we look for the presence of the immatures, there's a real important point here that our friends from Georgia had keyed in on several years ago. Go to the 5th leaf, the 5th leaf below the terminal, and snap it off. It'll snap off real easy, and look for the presence of immatures there. Now, I was in some fields last week and would snap off the 3rd leaf below the terminal, the 4th leaf, and see very little. I would move down one more node and snap off the 5th leaf. It was a whole different picture. So that is a real key, is going to that 5th leaf below the terminal and look for the presence of the immatures underneath the leaf. Underneath the leaves. We have several chemicals in our recommendation. The one that has gotten the most use and has performed real good for us is NAC. We have got a state label where 5 ounces can be used at 2 different times with NAC, and that means that we may or may not need that second application depending on the age of the cotton and maturity. I need to also say a couple of things, that this pest is going to be potentially more damaging to later planting cotton, because we're going to have to take that cotton on into September, and the whiteflies tend to increase in numbers once they occur as the season progresses. The other thing is the drier the weather, the worse this pest is going to be. And of course, we've been in a dry week or so here recently, and we've got some pockets that really have not had any rain out of all these scattered thunderstorms, and they are at high risk for the silverleaf whitefly. So rainfall is our friend. Earliness is our friend with cotton, because there's not much we can do about that now. But let me just see if Dr. Graham can would like to add some things. If there's anything we could say, Dr. Graham, that to that, I'd be happy for you to add it.
I think you covered it pretty well. Just, the difference of being too early and too late is pretty short window there. So it's all about timing. A lot of that is just scouting and being in the field and looking at your crop, consistently.
Let me also add that we have had the opportunity to go to some areas this year that were already heavily infested, but we wanted to be up to date for this meeting. So day before yesterday, we made a tour down in the southeastern area of our state and observed a few fields for the presence of silverleaf whitefly. And in our short survey there, we did not find any in Alabama yet, but it's likely just a matter of time because we've got a long way to go with this season and a lot of our later planted fields in the southern area of the state. Okay, let's see. We've got some pictures here. This would be a picture of adults clustering underneath the leaves. You'll see this up in the terminal, but you can also see it lower down on the plant. Immatures. For the person with average or poor eyesight, these are going to be pretty hard to distinguish. They're a little bit like aphids, and we just picked up from Dr. Philip Roberts last week a little trick here. If they're mixed with aphids, and sometimes they can be, if you'll just wipe this leaf on a shirt, the aphids will come off, and the immature whiteflies being stuck to the leaf as immature scale type insects, they're going to be on the leaf, so we can separate those out right away. But anyway, this is, and really I think our field people really would be better if they had some 10x magnification. So any store that sells arts and crafts or anything should have something that you can keep in your pocket to get the 10x magnification and separate these from the aphids, the little immature aphids, which are going to be slow-bodied with the little cornicles, and you don't see that in the silverleaf whitefly. I believe on this leaf, we also, you may not on the screen here, but there should be some eggs on here. I know that the eggs are increasing in fields that are infested now, and that means that we've got a real explosion ahead of us in some fields, or we may have before the year's over. With that, we'll close this part and move on to whatever's next. I hope we're close to being on time today. And I don't know if we're lined up to do any questions or comments, but I appreciate the attendance. And I don't know if we've got Dr. Philip Roberts or Dr. Jeremy Green viewing in today, but hopefully I didn't butcher our discipline too much with that. So we appreciate having you. You put us on the spot by all the expertise that you folks have.
We'll be talking about beneficial insects and sporadic pests of cotton. And I like to say that this year we've had a lot of more calls on sporadic pests, one being grasshoppers. And if you're a scout, what you need to do is know where they are in the field, give approximate amount of damage that they're doing, and maybe some indication about the number of grasshoppers that you have. We don't have.
Eddie,
yes.
Can you swap your display settings?
Over how?
In the top. Yep, right there.
Right there?
No, to the right. And swap. Yep. Thank you.
I'm sorry. Is that got it correct?
Yep, you're good.
But in the comments section, you'll note that there's a place to put comments, and this is where you need to put sporadic pests. The farmer needs to be aware, if you're a scout or a consultant, if there's any sporadic pests in the field and things that he needs to be concerned about. Another one we've got a lot of calls on is snails, mostly in the southern part of the state, but they don't actually feed on the plant, but the numbers were so high on the young plants, they were actually breaking off the stem just to the weight of the snails. So just report these in the comment section. We've been seeing more and more pre-corn alfalfa hopper damage in cotton, and they'll do the same type of damage that they do in soybeans. In other words, they'll girdle the stems, and when you get later in the season, you get any wind, they'll break over. So if you notice three-corner alfalfa hoppers or they're damaged, just put those in the comment section. Now I want to get to things that at one time we didn't even think were a pest, but they can be, and that one is the false chinch bugs. For years and years, when I first started in the early 80s in doing scout schools, we'd see these false chinch bugs in cotton, and we just say they were incidental pests. Well, about 20 years later, when we started to get into minimum till or no-till cotton, we had a lot more organic residue. We noticed that the chinch bugs were building up on the places where we had a lot of organic residue, and there was so numerous on the young cotton plants that they were literally killing them. So here's a case where we switched our production practices, and a pest that we considered incidental all of a sudden became a pest in certain fields. I also want to encourage you to carry some kind of vial or a pill bottle. If you find an insect that you don't know what it is, that you go ahead and put it in the vial and get it properly identified. This is a insect that I've only seen once, and this is cotton leafworm. And I saw this when I was in southwest Georgia in Bainbridge, right near the Florida line. So you can run into a pest that you don't know what it is. Go ahead and get it properly identified, because misidentification of insects can lead to unnecessary sprays. Now, last year I was called out to a couple of fields in Cherokee County, and they were concerned early in the season about whiteflies. They've been hearing a lot about them in the press. Well, when I went out there, it looked strange, but when you went out to the cotton and you touched the cotton, all these white things would fly up. And I can definitely see why they thought they were whiteflies. What they actually were was an insect called the phantom midge. And in the larva stage, they're glassworms, and they were breeding in Lake Wise, and a lot of them were coming out onto the cotton. They weren't doing any damage, but the problem was that they could easily have been misidentified as whiteflies. Here's one that I got a couple calls on. They thought they were plant bugs, and this was just up in the terminal, and this is the white margin burrower bug. It's a relative to the burrower bug that attacks peanuts, but it's not the same species. Doesn't really do any damage in cotton, but it's important that we identify it properly. And then are some beneficial insects that can sometimes be mistaken for harmful insects. And this is the spine soldier bug. And one thing I like about it, the egg mass is just beautiful. It has a golden egg mass with a little crown around it. So I've always been amazed by this egg mass. I'm not really concerned about scouts or consultants misidentifying the spine soldier bug for brown stink bug, because we really don't do or base our sprays on stink bugs on the number we find out in the field, but rather the damage to the bolls. And then some insects can be both friend and foe. A perfect example is fire ants. They're great beneficial insects, especially in our minimum till or no-till soils, getting escape worms. But at the same time, they can crawl up onto the plant, protect aphids, and they feed on the honeydew. And if you're a scout, you'll notice sometimes when you're walking along the field, sometimes you have a lot of aphids, and these fire ants are up the plants. They actually get on you and cause some problems with biting and stinging. I do want to say that in the past, I've conducted 2 surveys belt-wide with entomologists, and I did one in the late 1990s and did a beneficial insect publication for Progressive Farmer. Then I did one in 2012, where the entomologists actually ranked the importance of the beneficial insects. And so I do want to thank these entomologists. I've got with Cotton Grower Magazine, and they're going to publish the update on the beneficial insects. But there's an important thing when we think about beneficial insects. It's not the individual beneficial insects, although some may be a little bit more important than others. But Dr. Scott Stewart from Tennessee had a great comment, and he said the natural enemy system is complex, and it is the accumulative impact that make them so valuable. So it's the overall impact of all these beneficials that make them so valuable. And then also that we need to think of beneficial insects as a novel and a free mode of action. Now, the value of beneficial insects can vary across the cotton belt. When you get out to the far west, they're more concerned about beneficial insects that attack whiteflies. Here, we're more concerned sometimes about beneficial insects of the complex that are worms, aphids, other insects that are more important to us. And also, the type of production system that you have can influence the amount of beneficial insects or the type or species of beneficial insects you have. When you have a system that is minimum till, reduced till, or no till, and you compare that to conventional tillage, well, in the reduced tillage systems, you'll have more fire ants, and they're a very important beneficial insect for us in the southeast. And of course, the species value has changed over time. Some species that were very important before the boll weevil eradication program and BT cotton aren't as valuable today because the insect hosts that were out there aren't out there now. And I'll give you a perfect example, and that is the beet armyworm complex, which Dr. Ron Smith mentioned earlier. Back before we had the boll weevil eradication program, they were doing a good job of controlling beet armyworms. When we started making our our boll weevil eradication sprays, we eliminated the Cotesian wasp. And if you can remember back then, if you're old enough, we had a terrible time with beet armyworms. Well, now with BT cotton, beet armyworms aren't a pest of cotton so much today. They may be here in a field or two, but not the way they were back before or during when we had the boll weevil eradication program. And it's hard to put a value on beneficial insects. I know that they've actually had research out in Arizona, Dr. Peter Ellsworth, where they have put a dollar value on the beneficial insects, and it's $40 to $50 per acre, and this is research based. We don't have a value here in the southeast, but I'm quite sure that it would approach that value here, and that's just free money for the growers sitting in the field. I would point out that when we make our insecticide sprays, we need to consider, especially early and middens in the season, what impact those sprays are going to have on beneficial insects. So if you look in our Alabama Extension IPM Cotton Guide, you'll see the ranking, and it's a good ranking on beneficial insects. So if you'll just pay attention to this, this will help you, maybe go to a less or a safer mode of action on beneficial insects with your insecticides and save these beneficial insects since they're doing so much good. Now, when we talk about beneficial insects, really need to divide them into two classes, and that's our predators. And usually these are the insects that we can see because they kill and eat their prey. And they fall into two categories. One is the sucking category, where they put their stylet into an insect and suck the juices out of that insect, and then the chewing. So good examples of sucking beneficial insects would be the minute pirate bug and the big-eyed bugs. Chewing would be something like lacewings or lady beetles. And then we also have our parasites. And a lot of these are so small that you really won't recognize them out in the field. And you need either a hand lens or a dissectoscope to see them. And then we have another class that I put in with the parasites, and that's our pathogens. And this would be something like the aphid fungus, which is very important to us for controlling aphids. So let's look at a few of these beneficial insects. This is a picture of the big-eyed bug. The big-eyed bug and the minute pirate bug were consistently ranked pretty close as the top two beneficials by the entomologists across the Southeast. So they're extremely important beneficial insects to us. Now, when you're out there, you may see these eggs. I know Ron showed the big-eyed bug eggs. These are lady beetle eggs. And then they hatch out into a very colorful immature stage, and this is the immature stage of the lady beetle. And then we got a lot of different species of lady beetles out there. So, there may be 10 or 15 different species that we'll be able to see during the year. Fire ants are extremely important. Again, I mentioned how important they are in the no-till and the reduced-till systems. They're excellent predators going up the stalk, finding escaped bollworms. When the bollworms, if they get big enough and they drop to the ground and they try to pupate out, the fire ants often find them then and get them before they can get into the ground. Spiders, there's a whole complex of spiders. This is the green link spider, very common spider that we find out in the field. And we'll also find several different species. One is a crab spider. When you get out to the far west, this is a very important species to them out in into the far west, Arizona and California. Here's another one that's important, and this is the graying lacewing egg, and it's laid up on a stalk to protect it from other insects feeding on it. And you'll see these often out in the field. Now, the brown lacewing egg is not laid on a stalk like the green lacewing egg. Of course, when you get to the immature stage of the lacewings, they're very good beneficial insects attacking insects. You'll see them a lot when we have problems with aphids. And here is the adult. Now we have a whole complex of damsel bugs, and they're very active predators. They stick their stylus into the worms or soft-bodied insects, suck the juices out. Excellent. Here's a predator insect that we don't see very much, but they're very active in helping us to control spider mites. And this is predatory mites. And they're very active, and it's hard for us to really quantify how well they do on spider mites, but they're an important beneficial insect. And here's the spine soldier bug. It's often mistaken for the brown stink bug. You'll notice that the spines on the brown stink bug are very pronounced. Hoverflies are here's the larva stage. You often see these small insects flying around the field. This is the adult fly of the hoverfly. And then, of course, we have ground beetles. Here's the larva, and here's a tiger ground beetle. I want to get, in the last few minutes, I want to talk about our parasites and pathogens. Probably the most important one to us is the cotton aphid fungus. It's probably, you'll see the aphid populations build up during the season, and all of a sudden this fungus will come in and their populations will crash. One thing I do want to mention is that a lot of these insects are so small that we're not able to see them. Here is a wasp that is attacking the aphid. It's very important. Here's one that we often see out in the field, and that is the Cotesian wasps. We'll see the single eggs. We used to see them a lot more when we had beet armyworms. Here's a species that's not as important, and that is the what we is nicknamed the red-tailed wasp, and it's very specific to the tobacco budworm, which we don't see very much in cotton very much due to the BT cotton. So we don't see this beneficial as much as we used to before the introduction of BT cotton. And then we have some flies out here, taconic flies. This is if you look over here on this here, you'll see their eggs laid. Their eggs will hatch out into a maggot which bores into the worm and feeds internally. Of course, the worm quits eating, and he's or she is dead before they just don't know it. This is a field where I saw armyworms, and just about every armyworm had a taconic fly egg on it. And then there's also a lot of cotton funguses out there, and I want to wind up with that. I've got about a minute for any questions, but I want to stay on my time schedule also.
And I had not seen the red-tailed wasp, the Cardiacoles, in many years. And we started growing some tobacco to collect tobacco budworms down in Headland, and we had to get there really quick to get the tobacco budworms before the Cardiacoles red-tailed wasp got them. So they're still in the system. There's just no place for them to feed in cotton.
Yeah, that's the thing, Ron. If there's not a host out there in the field for them, then the beneficial insect. That's why late in the season, sometimes when we're spraying for stink bugs, the beneficials aren't as important because there's not as many pests out there that they can attack.
All right, so now we'll move to soybean insect pests that we may find in a soybean field at a given time in Alabama. And so for this presentation, Dr. Smith and I will kind of just go back and forth a little bit, talking about the different pests, giving a little information as needed. So the tools of the trade are pretty similar for soybean scouting as they are for cotton scouting. Again, record keeping is very important, as is having the proper sampling equipment. A lot of sweep nets is what our thresholds are based on in soybeans. We do have some per row foot, which would be the drop cloth. And again, staying hydrated, protecting yourself from the sun and things like that are very important. Anytime we go out into a field by ourselves, make sure folks know where we are and when we should be somewhere else and things like that. So also similar to cotton, there can be a whole lot of bugs in a soybean field at a given time. So it's important that we kind of have an understanding of the different growth stages and timings, what bugs are important, what bugs aren't. Some are important when you see them in the seedling stage, but less important when you get to the reproductive stage. So it's just important to kind of have a good idea for that. We may see cutworms, three-cornered alfalfa hoppers, grasshoppers, kudzu bugs, a lot of different caterpillar pests that, Dr. Smith talked about during the cotton portion. Different defoliating beetles may be in our fields, and certainly stink bugs can be in the mix as well. So there's just some different things to think about, and got our different reproductive growth stages there. Personally, I like the reproductive stages of cotton easier. It's a little bit easier to just say first week of bloom, second week of bloom than it is all these R1, R3.5, that kind of stuff. But it is important that we have a good general knowledge. R1 is going to be when we find an open flower anywhere on a plant on 50% of the plants in the field. R3 is when our pods are 3/16 of an inch long in the upper four uppermost nodes. R5, they say, is when the seed is 1/8 of an inch long on one of the four uppermost nodes of the plants. R6 is full seed. A pod contains a green seed that fills the pod cavity in one of the four uppermost nodes. And then R8 is when 95% of the pods have reached mature pod color, gone from green to the tan or brown. And generally at that point, you're within a week to 10 days of hopefully being able to harvest the crop. So the three-cornered alfalfa hopper is one that is very, very common to see in our soybean fields. You walk around or run your sweep net, and they're jumping everywhere, and we get pretty excited about them at times. You see the adult there on the left, kind of a triangular shaped green insect. The immature on the right is much smaller and kind of spiny or hairy looking, still a green color. The adults are highly mobile. They, like I said, they jump around big time walking through the field. The immatures are they're pretty docile. They're where they are on the plant, and they don't they don't jump around and move a whole lot once they get where they are. So here's just some classic symptoms of what we see from three-cornered feeding in soybean fields. You see the girdling here. This big knot is caused by the adults or the immatures will attach themselves to the stem and work their way around, feeding, sucking juices from the stem, and it leaves this knot, which can reduce the movement of photosynthesis and things up and down the plant. And then oftentimes we don't necessarily realize we had an issue with three-corners until later in the season when we've got a good pod set and a windstorm comes through, or we're going through sweeping with our sweep net and plants start breaking over. It can be tempting to try to get a revenge spray on those guys at that time, but that damage was likely done during the seedling stage. So really not a lot you can do once you're walking through a field. At R5, if plants are lodging over, that damage was done a long time previous to when you're seeing the symptoms. So kind of the last slide we've got on three corners here, they tend to be worse when beans are following a cover crop or reduced tillage. It's a good situation for the three corners to really develop and already be in the field, and then you plant into it, and there they are. Our insecticide seed treatments can provide some suppression of the girdling. Overall, our damage potential is pretty low. They'll feed on the main stems and seedling soybeans, and then later on they may feed on petioles, cause leaves to drop and things like that. In the seedling stage, our threshold is just when stands are threatened. So that's kind of what your targeted plant population is, and when you feel like that's threatened, you may want to intervene. When beans are 10 inches or taller, the threshold is 2 per sweep. So that means if you do sorry, we're getting a little feedback from somebody here. You could please make sure you're muted, if you don't mind. But anyway, so our threshold is 2 per sweep. So that means if you do 100 sweeps, you would need 200 three corners to hit threshold. And, you know, there's been a lot of research done that suggests that you could probably go up to maybe even 5 per 1 sweep. So that would be 500 in a set of 100 sweeps. So they're out there. You know, they look exciting when you're in the field and they're jumping around, but not real likely that we're probably going to need to make any applications. I don't know if you got anything to add to that, Dr. Smith?
I would just say I think the real susceptible time for three-cornered is when they're in a real early stage, right after they emerge. The girdle in there can have an impact, but I think later in the season, when the numbers get real high and we find them then, I don't think they're really very economic at that point.
And one good thing about soybeans with three corners compared to cotton is you can have some compensation the plants around it. You know, you can get away with that. So.
One thing I thought I noticed last year on one of our research farms where I was looking at some plantings for a three-cornered is I kind of saw a border effect. I'm not sure they always evenly distribute across the field either.
All right, so moving into our next pest, if the slide will advance. There we go. So now talking a little bit about kudzu bugs. So these are a somewhat new pests for us that are invasive. Started moving in several years ago now, and they're pretty widely established at this point. You see the adult here is this kind of olive green color. Maybe resembles a very small stink bug a little bit. Can certainly produce a similar smell to stink bugs. They're a big congregate insect. So, you know, when you see one, you'll see a bunch of them oftentimes up and down plant stems. So they are stem feeders. That's primarily where they're getting their nutrients from, sucking juices out of the stems. Here's an image of an immature kudzu bug. It's kind of a flat, tannish color. Appears to be very heavy when you see it. And that's really the key, what we're looking for when we're making treatment decisions. And here is an image, if you can see, of the eggs with a fresh hatchling. So they lay kind of barrel-shaped eggs, but they're laid sideways in rows of 2, and they're kind of a whitish color. Then you'll see the small yellow immatures when they first hatch, which kind of turn into more of this tannish green color that you see. So we're generally the first generation is going to develop on kudzu before it moves into soybeans. So that's kind of where they're coming from. The kudzu is a pain for a lot of reasons, and these new pests are certainly one of them. From egg to adult can take them anywhere from 6 to 8 weeks, just depending on temperature and things like that. Generally, you know, they kind of build on field edges before they move into the field, so it's important that when we're scouting, we're not just looking at the first 10 rows. We're moving into the field and making sure that they're widely distributed. This is another one, Dr. Smith, that's really important that we wait until we see the immatures, particularly when the beans are in the reproductive stage a little bit later, because they can continue to reinfest the field. But once those immatures hatch out, they're stuck there. They can't fly. They can't really move around out of the field. So at that point, you can make a well-timed spray and control these things. Our threshold prior to R1, prior to flowering, is 10 per plant. From R1 to R6, we're looking at 1 immature per sweep. So again, that's if I do 100 sweeps in the field, that's 100 immature kudzu bugs.
I might just say that they seem to resurge this year in numbers. It's been going down for several years after the initial movement into an area. But this year, for some reason, they came back in pretty high numbers. But we saw the disease occurring a couple of weeks ago now in the Prattville area of central Alabama. So
this Bavaria fungus will move in and does a pretty good job of cleaning up these kudzu bugs. So that's something that, as Eddie talked about, our are beneficial. This is certainly one of the things that helps us fight these guys. And it's pretty impressive when it moves in and takes hold. It can really take care of these kudzu bugs quick. So we got a question about the QR code. I'll show that again in just a second. At the end of this presentation, we'll show that again. So now I don't want to spend just a whole lot of time talking about the foliage feeding beetles that are out there, but we do see several. One is the bean leaf beetle. You see image here of a couple of different looking beetles there. They're pretty small. They can be in several different colors. They can have spots, no spots, but the key characteristic of these bean leaf beetles, as we see with this arrow here, is this black triangle right at the top of the wings. So that's how we can differentiate the bean leaf beetle from a cucumber beetle or something like that, is the presence of that black triangle at the top of the wings. We also, from time to time, see Mexican bean beetles. They're not real common. They're pretty interesting looking immature there, all spiky, spiny, yellow larvae. The adult looks similar to a lady beetle, so that's something to keep in mind. We don't want to spray lady beetles thinking that they're Mexican bean beetles, so identification is important. You may see Japanese beetles from time to time. We, on the research station in the Tennessee Valley earlier this summer, we saw a pretty good infestation of Japanese beetles in some soybeans, and came back a week later and they pretty much gone, which I think can be typical of these Japanese beetles. They'll move in and out pretty quick, but they can do a lot of defoliation in a short amount of time if given the opportunity. Then you may also see blister beetles, which are important because they produce a substance called cantharidin that will hurt you if it gets on you, for lack of a better way to explain it. But these guys, typically, they're kind of being clumps out in the field. Often you'll see a pickup truck size area in the field that's been defoliated. And a lot of times you go in there and look at it, it's blister beetles. But if you see blister beetles in the field, please don't grab them. They'll get you. It'll hurt really bad. And these defoliated beetles are really part of a complex, really, of defoliating pests in general. We've got several foliage feeding caterpillars that play a role in this complex, and we'll talk about thresholds later. But really, a lot of our thresholds for these defoliating insects are based on sampling to understand what complex of pests are in the field, and then looking at the defoliation of the soybean crop and making a treatment decision based on that. So moving into some of the caterpillars, we've got green clover worms are one that we'll see during the season. They're a green worm with this white stripes going down. The key for clover worms are the three prolegs. So on a caterpillar pest or caterpillars, we have the true legs that are up towards the head. We have what we entomologists call prolegs, kind of towards the back or the middle, and then the anal legs are on the rear end. But a lot of different caterpillar pests that we see in fields, we're looking at prolegs to give us an idea of what pest we may be dealing with, and the green clover worm has three. Velvet bean caterpillar is another one. It's another green pest with a whitish or yellowish stripe going down the side. It has four prolegs. So again, we got the true legs towards the head. The prolegs are more in the back to the middle. The velvet bean caterpillar has four. And it's important that we understand the prolegs, and we understand the difference between a velvet bean and a green clover worm from this next one in particular, which is the soybean looper. This is a tropical pest that comes up every year and can really do a lot of damage in a short amount of time if larvae are left in the field untreated and build up to numbers to do damage. So soybean loopers are going to have two prolegs. There is another looper called a cabbage looper, which is really difficult to identify in the field. So we just pretty much, I think, Dr. Smith, I don't know if you would agree, we probably just need to assume we're dealing with soybean loopers.
Yeah, I call them soybean loopers if they're in soybeans because that's we don't have cabbage loopers are not an economic pest of soybeans, but soybean loopers are, and when you get them, you get a lot of them moving in and have a high damage potential, particularly in the central and southern part of the state.
One interesting thing about soybean loopers is they actually pupate on the leaf. So you see an image here of the pupa, kind of the silk spun around it, but so the pupa is actually up on the leaf instead of down in the soil like most of our caterpillar pests.
Could I say one more thing about the loopers? I know some of our field people have always thought that soybean loopers have black prolegs. They do, and cabbage loopers don't. But soybean loopers can have black or green prolegs. So if they're in soybeans, count them all soybean loopers. They have a lot of damage potential, particularly as we approach 5 or so per row foot.
So here, that's a good point. It is just, if we've got two prolegs, a green caterpillar, two prolegs looping, I think it's safe to assume it's a soybean looper. There's also inchworms in the family Diametridae that loop like a soybean looper, but they have one set of prolegs, not two sets of prolegs.
Can we say one more thing here? When we talk about the green clover worms, they wiggle like a velvet bean caterpillar because we can't separate the activity of the larvae like that, but also they loop like the loopers.
That's right.
So we really have to focus on those legs. So we really, the green clover worm is a relatively minor pest. It's very rare that it gets, becomes economic levels.
Right, yeah, so that's a good point. And here's just some images of some other, pests that we may or may not see. Beet armyworms, which Dr. Smith already described in great detail, and we mentioned that we saw some a field infested this year with beet armyworms, which you may see fall armyworms, you may see silver spotted skippers, salt marked caterpillars, painted lady larvae, all of these different things. Not common that you'll see, these pests or really anything I'd say, but soybean loopers at threshold levels by themselves. As I mentioned earlier, we're dealing with a complex of different pests that are feeding on foliage.
And the other thing that I've experienced, particularly down in the Gulf Coast area, is some years the soybean loopers will come in before the velvet bean caterpillar, both for semi-tropical pests. Other years, the velvet bean caterpillar may be before the loopers, and quite often there's a peak of one of them followed immediately by the peak of the other one. So you may have the foliating species there for 10 to 20 days at economic levels. So
speaking of the economic levels, so we're kind of using looking at the plants to tell us instead of necessarily just focusing on I have X amount of caterpillars per sweep or beetles per sweep, because it's not often that we're going to get enough velvet bean caterpillars to do the foliation worth treating levels. So prior to bloom, our defoliation is 35%. That's our threshold, 35% defoliation. From R1 through the rest of the season, we're looking at 20% defoliation. You maybe can bump that up to a little bit higher or a little bit higher percent defoliation later in the year. But when we're trying to set our pods and fill our seed, it's important that we have a lot of leaf area producing photosynthesis to move nutrients to the seeds. And again, the sweep net and the drop cloth is very important to help us know what pests are in the field, identifying which beetles or which caterpillars are in the field. And you see here an image from Marlin Rice of percent defoliation. And one thing I'll say is that we're probably more likely to over-exaggerate the foliation than we are, or overestimate than we are underestimate the foliation. It kind of takes a lot of time and practice to be able to really get that down. The one thing, a new application is developed I learned about at an entomology meeting a couple of years ago. It's called Leaf Bite. So this is a really neat app. It takes a little bit of time, but maybe if you're in a situation where you really can't make a decision today, maybe this could help you. If you pull leaves from the top and the bottom of the canopy, and with this app, you just take a white piece of paper and mark 4 dots, and you can go in and tell the Leaf Bite app, these dots are this far apart. So then it's able to determine the square centimeters on the leaf or on the paper, and then you put the leaf on there. I've got a little video to show you just how quick it is. So it'll pull up. There we go. So there's our leaf that's been defoliated. I snap a picture of it. I can move out the white noise. So now, okay, it's found my scale. It knows how big the leaf is. I can go in and draw to where the foliage is missing on the corner there. And it tells me that leaf is 17.573% defoliated. So it's, like I say, it's a good way. It does take some time. It's a free application. I think right now it's only on iPhones. They haven't developed it for Android yet, but it's called Leaf Bite, and it can really be pretty useful. Like I said, if you just really can't decide if you need to pull, or if you want to test your scouts or your buddies and see who can do the best job with the foliation ratings, that's a good application that's free that can really help you in those situations.
Let me add one more comment here before we move away from the foliage feeders. If you're in the Gulf Coast area, the potential is so great down there that if you see, and it's not uncommon for us to get 50 to 100 small velvet bean, soybean loopers per drop per 5 feet. So when you get that, you don't necessarily have to wait till you get 20% damage before you spray.
Right.
If you know the potential's there, they're not going to die out. So you just need to go on and react and not let it may get into bad weather or something like that. So if you see the potential in numbers, go ahead and treat on numbers.
Right. Yeah. If I may be there next week, I'll wait for a storm to blow up and keep you out of the field. That's right. So now moving into the pod feeders. Podworms, also known as corn earworm or bollworm, not a real common pest for our soybeans, right, Dr. Smith?
And not in recent years. When we talk about 5 or 6 years or so, they've been a very minor problem here. I don't understand why we're have lower numbers than some other states in the South on this pest, but they're just not. It's not happening. We take hundreds of drop claws or hundreds of sweet samples a year, and it's very rare that we find a podworm. There have been some years, probably 5 to 8 years ago, where we had an outbreak, but it's not common. I will say this, where our foliage feeders are more common along the Gulf Coast and southern areas, the podworm has historically been more of a problem in the northern part of the state.
So, again, the podworm is also the corn earworm or bollworm. So I think, we're probably all pretty familiar with this animal. Obviously, four pro legs. If we're looking at it, in a soybean field, trying to decide if it's a velvet bean caterpillar or a bollworm, kind of the orangish head capsule there is the key. These guys are they're gonna feed on pods more so than leaves and defoliation. They're trying to get the pod and the seed. The moths are attracted to it, and at the R1, R2 stage, when there's a lot of flowers, they'll come in. They can lay eggs. They also, for whatever reason, really seem to prefer open canopies. So if you've got a late planted crop that's blooming and the canopy's still pretty open, that field could be a candidate for podworms. Our threshold for these is 1 per row foot or 3 per 15 sweeps. So this is something, probably historically, maybe not going to run into an issue with these guys, but, something we do need to be aware of, because if you get into a situation with a lot of piled worms, they can do a lot of damage. So moving into our stink bugs now, we've got several species that may invade our soybean fields during the season. We kind of think of what we kind of term our native stink bugs: the green, southern green, and brown stink bugs, which Dr. Smith talked about with cotton already, and then our invasive, the brown marmorated, and the ever famous red-banded stink bug that's or infamous, I guess I should say. That's kind of the stink bugs that we're primarily looking for in our soybean fields. Depending on the species and weather and things, they can go from first instar to adult from anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks. So these are pests that once they get into a field and they kind of establish, they're going to be there for a while. So it's something that we need to be scouting for and prepared to intervene with insecticides when necessary. So here's some images of green stink bugs. Like I said, we've already kind of talked about a little bit, but you can see the hatchlings here when they're still kind of grouped together and excreting their stink pheromone or their stink defense mechanism to protect themselves while they're still small and more susceptible. As they molt and grow, they'll spread out and disperse a little bit more. One of the ways to identify the green stink bug immature is the orange or yellowish shoulders that they have. Then obviously the adult is a big, robust green stink bug. Brown stink bugs, which Dr. Smith talked about already, is kind of a greenish tannish color as the immature. Then it grows into the brown stink bug. There is the adult. Southern green stink bugs are, to me, one of the more prettier, if you will, bugs that we may see in the field. The immatures, as they grow and develop, have these nice pink markings along the outside and down the middle of the back. To me, it's a neat looking immature stink bug. The adult looks similar to the green stink bug. The southern green has some differences in the stink glands on its underside, which I don't know that we really need to get into trying to look at the stink glands of a stink bug, but they also may have alternating red bands on their antennae is another way to kind of help identify from the green stink bug for the southern green. Then the brown marmorated stink bug is a new one that's come over and kind of taken over. We'll see these things in our houses. They're coming in to overwinter. They're attracted to white surfaces and things, so they're a nuisance for us when we're at home. They're a pest for us when we're in our crops. So they're a stink bug that we certainly need to be looking for. And the immature really is pretty unique looking, at least compared to the brown stink bug. It's more of a brown color. It's got these alternating white bands along the legs and on the antennae. The adults also have those alternating white bands along the eggs and antennae, and then as well along the wings. These tend to be kind of start on the field edges, Dr. Smith, and then work their way in.
They definitely have an edge effect. They seem to be happy just in cotton, for example, going into the first 8 or 10 rows and hanging out there. Of course, they'll go all the way through corn because they've got a long period of time to infest that crop. The couple other things I'd say about this, we think the brown marmorated stink bug is present in most all counties north of Montgomery. And I think homeowners probably have not recognized this pest as much as their field people have, but they are a bad pest in home gardens and on fruit trees and things like that. So we need to be more aware of the presence of this pest in everything, all our crops and gardens.
And then now the hot topic among the soybean entomology community in the South right now is the red-banded stink bug. So this is another tropical pest that's moved in, and when we have, back-to-back mild winters, these things can really kind of establish and get growing. We've already had some acres in West Alabama sprayed for red-banded stink bugs this year already. A lot of treatments have been going out in Louisiana as well. So this is for a smaller stink bug, it really does do a lot more injury. So here's a unique for stink bugs. The eggs are laid in rows of 2. They're kind of a grayish, blackish color. Egg mass will be anywhere from 10 to 15 or 20 in a hit of eggs. So here's a picture of the immature stink bug. It looks pretty unique, really. Not a lot of immature stink bugs that look like this red-banded, kind of an oval shape with these characteristic yellowish, greenish markings on the sides, and the red and black alternating down the middle. So here's images of the adults. They can really look different. The red band across the back is where they get their name, but it can be red, it can look purple, it can almost look orange or yellowish. It can be very, very faint. The red band is generally there, but it can look different. The key on this pest is this spine here, sticking from between the last 2 leg segments, sticking back up towards the stomach, towards the face. This spine here is how we differentiate the red-banded stink bug from the red-shouldered stink bug. So that's another one that we may or may not see in the field. It's got this red line going across the shoulders. It's a smaller stink bug like the red-banded stink bug is. They're not as big as the green or the southern green stink bug. But the way that we differentiate the two is the presence again here of this spine right between the two the last 2 legs sticking back up towards its face. On the red-shouldered stink bug, we do not have that spine. So that's if in doubt, check for that spine to make sure that you're dealing with the red-banded stink bug. So in talking with our colleagues in the Mid-South and doing some reading and things, we're learning, part of this, the reason that these red-banded stink bugs are doing more damage is that they do feed deeper than other stink bugs. Some research has shown that they'll feed up to 2 millimeters deep, while the southern green stink bug, which is a much larger, robust bug, only feeds 1.2 millimeters. And also their saliva is more destructive, and it can spread up to 3.5 millimeters away. So that's part of the issue. Not only are they feeding deeper, but then that saliva can spread and cause more injury on the seed further away from just wherever they probed. They also, interestingly, they'll feed on stem and leaf tissue. So I think that's for water regulation, possibly. But they'll feed on that. So that maybe contributes to the green bean syndrome that we see with these pests. Could explain why we're finding them on vegetative and early R stage beans when there's no seed there for them to feed on. As a matter of fact, I mentioned we've had some fields treated already this year, and those fields were early R stage and vegetative stage, but there were threshold levels of red bandits.
Dr. Graham, you might note that you found these on red clover, crimson clover at Prattville, I believe, or in that area way back before the season started very early, which indicated they overwintered there.
That's right. And that brings up a point there. These stink bugs, unlike our, what we call our native stink bugs, are highly attracted to legume plants. So they're not going to be an issue in cotton, shouldn't be an issue in corn, things like that. But they develop on crimson clover, red clover in the spring, and then move into soybeans.
And let me also add that when we surveyed beans weekly, season long at Prattville last year, and the end of the year, this species of stink bug by far outnumbered the others. In other words, they were the dominant stink bug in the system on soybeans last year at Prattville, Alabama.
So that brings us to our thresholds for stink bugs. From bloom to mid-pod fill, we're looking at 1 per 3 row feet or 2 per 15 sweeps. After mid-pod fill, we moved on to 1 per 1 row foot or 3 per 15 sweeps. But keep in mind with this red-banded stink bug, we're sticking with that lower threshold, 1 per 3 row feet or 2 per 15 sweeps, really through the season. In Louisiana, South Louisiana places where this is a little bit more consistent pest, I mean, they're mixing in insecticides with their desiccant applications to control red-banded stink bugs. Then they can not only can they damage these mature seeds still, but they'll have them, so many in the field that they'll get docked when they go to sell the seeds for the stink bugs being in the mix. So these are, we don't want to necessarily sound the alarm and everybody go spray every acre they got for red bandits, but we do need to be scouting and be looking and make sure we can identify this pest and make applications when we need to. It's important that we stay ahead of them because once they get established, they can really reproduce quickly. And one other point to make, I think, Dr. Smith, is that in our indeterminate beans, where the potting starts in the bottom and works its way up, these red-banded stink bugs are going to be in the bottom where the pods are. So they're going to lay their eggs in the bottom, 6 to 12 inches of the canopy. That's where the immatures are going to be. So the sweep net may not always be the most effective sampling strategy. You may need to use a drop cloth or make visual counts, pushing back plants and looking lower in the canopy to find these guys, especially earlier on in the season when the pods are still in the bottom of the plant. So with that, again, we'll just plug our Alabama Crops Report newsletter and our soybean IPM guide, where all of our recommendations and rates and thresholds are given there, and the pest control update, again, something that we put out every week and kind of try to keep you up to date with what we're seeing across the state.
Well, let me just say the pest control update is focused primarily on cotton, but as we get into the later part of the season and we see these semi-tropical defoliators coming in, we'll definitely be talking about those on the pest control hotline.
All right, good morning, everyone. I appreciate the invitation this morning to speak to you all about Dicamba updates. And I'm going to be fairly brief of what already happened because most of y'all are well aware of the situation. So we don't have current registration with the XtendiMax Ingenia Fizzopan since early June, but everybody can still apply the stock that they have until July the 31st. But that doesn't mean that the old or revoked labels are not affecting the application. For example, if by July the 31st, your cotton has already passed the 60 days after planting, or your soybean has passed 45, the cutoff day, I think it's 45 days after planting, you cannot legally apply those chemicals beyond the cutoff dates, even though it is before July the 31st. So these two things are not contradictory to each other. Lots of sales, around the time frame after the court ban, and also your list is also under the radar of those special interest group, and I do believe we have to do a good job with your list, because if we keep using your list and causing issues and drift all over the place because we don't pay attention with the drift, eventually it's going to be on the chopping board of the Ninth Circuit. I mean, it might be already on it now. With today's environment, which is being fairly toxic, depends on how you look at it, I think Extend, Enlist, Ingenia, Fizzopan, all these popular pesticides may not be the last one that being put under the microscope for future scrutiny. because the plaintiff claimed this is a victory against Trump's EPA. You know, they're getting fairly political with all this stuff. So what's going to happen next? I don't know, but it's not going to be very pretty. So a few things to consider as we're moving on from this point and planning for 2021 crop. We know it's a fact that the popular cotton and the soybean varieties will continue to have the extend trades for whatever we can get next summer, because those seeds are growing in the field right now. So if somebody say, oh, I'm going to switch 10,000 acres to a non-extend variety, I'm not going to say he won't find the seeds for those large acreage, but it's going to be hard because majority of the variety, in particular the popular ones being offered, will still have the extend trait. All right, so that's the first fact to consider. The second one is, regardless of what's going on with the politics or the EPA decision or the court verdict, all right, regardless of all of those, generic Dicamba is still going to be available, and they're always being cheaper than the name brands, right? So they're always available because so far those special interest group or the plaintiffs have not tried to ban Dicamba as a molecule, and I'm not sure if that's feasible or not, right? All right, so you probably guess what I mean here by generic is still available and the trade is still in the seed. So EPA does not regulate seed trade. That's USDA's business. And so far, I don't think any lawsuit has been, getting into USDA's court and forcing them to remove, extend, or any GM trait so far. I'm not aware of any case in the past. For Alabama, and also for Georgia, Florida, South Carolina, and North Carolina, and part of Mississippi, we have been doing fairly good with Dicamba drift. Very few complaints every year for the last 4 or 5 years, That's quite different compared to the situation in Midwest. And also in Midwest this year, what I've been told is Iowa has quite a bit of damage this year compared to what it was in the past. The last fact to consider is resistant pigweed is not going away anytime soon, and they will keep evolving new resistance. That's another fact. If you're hoping your big old pigweed will walk away by themselves mysteriously, I don't know what to tell you. It may or may not happen. So what's the Dicamba's future, or what's the extend crop's future? Are we going to keep having to deal with all the headaches that we dealt with in the past? All right, I have to throw out a disclaimer on this page. Things I listed here may or may not happen. All right, so you can take this as Steve Lee's wild guess, based on the information we know so far from the manufacturer, from EPA, from the news or whatever. All right, I'm not gonna offer any compensation if my prediction is wrong. So, but it's a reasonable guess. That's what I'm telling everybody. So I thought about this pretty hard yesterday, and I came up with 4 outcomes based on whatever I know or the insider information I've heard. All right, so I list these outcomes from the most unlikely to the most likely sequence, in my opinion. Again, I could be wrong on this, so don't quote me on any of this stuff. This is just reasonable guess. First outcome is we're done with Dicamba forever, over-the-top applications, period. It's not going to happen ever again. I doubt this will happen, all right? At least if we lose over the top of label, we're still going to have the molecule. They can't ban the molecule. It's still labeled for pasture, hayfield, corn, small grain, roadside, or homeowner, like yard and stuff like that, right? So that's the first outcome, which I think is the most unlikely one. All right, the second outcome is new Dicamba formulation being approved and available maybe for 2021 season and beyond. I think they'll get, they may get approved eventually, but they may not be approved before the 2021 season, which means whatever we have for over the top label is hard to say, whether we can spray spray dicamba over the top. The third outcome is the new labels, the new federal labels of XtendiMax, Ingenia, and the Fisapan will be renewed. However, in the new federal labels, over-the-top applications may be banned. So each state can evaluate their own situation and issue 24C labels to allow over-the-top application if needed. All right. And a novel idea that we talk about, I think Dr. Culpepper in Georgia came up with this idea, is doing a regional label. I think that's a novel idea. Whether it's going to happen or not, hard to say. I don't know. Maybe they'll let a regional label happen. Maybe they let each state make the decision of what's the best for themselves. That's outcome 3. All right, the last outcome that I can foresee is new dicamba formulation label is approved sometime in 2021. This might be in the spring or the summer, depends on how the political environment and lawsuit progress in the next couple months. They may get labeled in 2021 by EPA, but it's too late for next year's crop. So maybe we're looking for those new products to be used in 2022 crop. XtendiMax, Ingenia, Fisapan might be back, but they will only receive a federal label for pre-plant and pre-only. You can't spray those over the top legally, which means no over the top option for 2021 season. Again, is this going to happen or not? I don't know, but I think it's likely that we may have to face no over-the-top option for at least next summer. Be prepared for that. It may not happen, but if it happens, don't be surprised, because there's no guarantee of anything at this point. All right. I mentioned briefly that Iowa has quite a bit of damage this year. Of course, there are a lot of different reasons for that. But if you look at this chart, it shows you during a 2-week time frame after the Ninth Circuit court ban of the dicamba herbicide, how many hours during the daytime the wind speed fall between 3 to 10 miles per hour, which means you're not likely to drift a lot under those conditions. So for those 2-week time frame, they only found 40 hours. That was when wind was blowing within 3 to 10 miles per hour, which means you can follow the label to legally apply without drifting too much. Other than that, it's going to be bad. And I'm not too surprised to see data like this, and I have seen something similar before, probably came from Missouri or somewhere, I think, or West Tennessee. I think the data they showed at that point was even worse. It's almost like they tracked the weather data for the whole June, and they found maybe 72 hours of good environmental conditions, which means the wind was not blowing crazy and temperature and all those fall into the label guideline. So it's gonna be hard to do things on time, and spray the weeds on time and follow the label requirements when wind is always blowing too much. So lots of dicamba went out in a short period of time, and those all contributed to the issue over there in the Midwest. All right, I mentioned that we may have to embrace the fact that we may not have dicamba to use next summer over the top. Now, if you decide to go off the label, use generics or just stockpile XtendiMax, Ingenia, whatever, and then still spray over the top, I'm not going to tell you no, because you make a decision what you do on your farm. Just don't cause the issue, get calls, right? That's not recommended, because the label says if the label says you can't do over the top, that's the law. But without Dicamba, I think we can still do a fairly good job with pigweed control in cotton, at least, because we have Liberty. So that means we got to start with a good residual program in burn down, whether you use Valor, Sharp, and Dire on cotton, or add yellow herbicide Warren for grass control. So you got to make sure you do some residual with your burn down and get you a clean field to plant. And don't have to deal with a foot tall pigweed already with seed head, in mid-May, if the April is fairly warm. All right, we got to use a pre behind the planter. All right, so if you still don't spray pre behind the planter, and you have a lot of weeds or pigweed, I mean it's no different than doing a naked run. That's what I call. If you go without a pre, you don't have any protection early on, and cotton doesn't grow very fast in the seedling stage. So it's almost guaranteed the cotton will lose big time at the starting line. So pre behind the planter is very important. I don't really care what you use as long as you use something. It's better than nothing, or running naked. You have to consider probably a two-way mix at a lower rate on some of the fields with high pigweed pressure. That always work better than one chemical by itself. And also the first shot is very important. If we don't have Dicamba, Liberty is the only thing that works on resistant pigweed. So Liberty plus a group 15 herbicide like Warren Dew Outlook is very important to spray it timely with ammonium sulfate. Ammonium sulfate is good stuff. It's going to heat up Liberty. I have a bunch of plots that I sprayed ammonium sulfate with Liberty. We kill some pretty good sized weed as well. But don't be late with your first pull. I said this thing a million times. 3 to 4 weeks after planting is great. If you still haven't sprayed pre 50 some days after planting, I can only blame that to applicators. They just didn't try to do things timely. For all kinds of reasons. Two-way mix parade work the best if you have timely rainfall to activate it. And also if you have a lot of pigweed in certain field that you don't feel comfortable with, if you just use Liberty, Elise is definitely an alternative option, and it works just fine for weed control. And the only labeled Dicamba for next summer is going to be Tavian. So Tavian will also be an option without those straight Dicamba over the top. So if you use Tavian, make sure you use it early, because if you use it late, it's going to burn your crop. So it's also part of next summer as well. So I can't say that we're completely out of Dicamba. Worst case scenario, we still have Tavian as the over-the-top application option. You just cannot do Tavian on too late of crop or on big crops. So looking at some plots from in the trials I have this year, not really checked July the 7th. You don't see cotton anymore. It's basically all weeds. All right, let's look at 3 things we sprayed in this very, very high weed pressure area. All right, Reflex Cotton was a two-way mix that we sprayed behind the planter on June the 3rd. In this first plot on the very left, all right, right here, we sprayed Roundup Paramax 32 ounces with the standard label rate of Tavian 56.5 ounces. That's a lot of product, goes out at one time, but it did a trick, clean up the pigweed fairly well and clean up the weeds. Picture was taken about 11 days after application. All right, the one in the middle was sprayed with Liberty and Dew Magnum on June the 26th. That was a Liberty-only program, no Dicamba. Things were looking good. If you have a good start like this and the residual, the Dew Magnum has been activated properly, this plot looks pretty good later on, without too much issue of weed. The last one was Roundup, Extendimax, and the Warrant, standard 3-way mix for a lot of growers. or if you use Ingenia, I think it will be fairly equivalent control-wise. All three are looking pretty good as long as your first post is not terribly late. In this case, I sprayed my first post 23 days after planting, which is a really good time frame, between 20 to 30 days after planting. Clean up the small weeds, no problem, and everything looks fine from that point. You're still going to have to spray over the top for the second time to clean them up, but after 2 shots over the top, they look pretty good. All right, the last thing I'll mention, and I think I still have about 2 minutes, is the antagonism on annual grasses. Many of y'all have told me you have seen this in the field. Some people are aware of this problem, some people are not. And I told y'all back in the spring during many spring production meeting is glyphosate, dicamba antagonism on annual grasses is confirmed, and that has been confirmed many, many years ago. So we know this problem for a while. So this year we have a large coordinated trial underway at Headland, Shorter, Balmina, South Georgia, and North Carolina, and maybe I can get one more location from Florida, but I just don't know about that yet. We have observed reduced grass control at multiple locations. It's not just a random event. I'm just telling y'all. And the grass species seems to respond to this antagonism fairly similarly. I have seen antagonism on goosegrass, crowfoot, crabgrass, jungle rice. At least that's 4 different species. All right. So it's not a unique thing on goosegrass because it's hard to kill. We saw adding Saline Max or Fusilade, those are grass-only herbicides, seems to increase the grass control, but that didn't make a day and night difference. We still have some grasses we didn't kill even with Saline Max and Fusilade, but that is a recommendation I would give to some of the growers if they have hard time to control large grasses with Roundup and Dicamba. Just mix some Saline Max or Fusilade with the techniques. It's going to help. Roundup alone is hard to beat, particularly on large grass. It's still by far the best option to clean up those grasses. All right, so I guess the weed science presentation won't be completed, or won't be a good one without showing some plot pictures. So let's look at some pictures. One picture worth 1,000 words, I believe. July 15th, actually last week, these are all red hot pictures, our data we just taken from last week. You can see the comparison between Roundup Power Max and Roundup Power Max mixed with Extended Max, DRA, and NIS. I don't even have to tell you, which one's which. You can tell the difference between those two at 12 days after treatment. Both plots were sprayed with large droplets, ultra coarse droplets with TPI nozzles at 15 gallons per acre. Those were plots at Shorter, Alabama, at a crop unit. Let's see. You know what? I think these are at Headland. My bad. Headland, Alabama. Headland, Alabama. This is from one location. These are the pictures from the other location, right? All right, Roundup Power Max on the left. That's the industry standard. Kill off the grasses really well. The middle one is Roundup Power Max with Extended Max, with a DRA, with an NIS. You can see the leftover grasses that we didn't kill in the middle, right? After you mix Saline Max 12 ounces with the same tank mix, it seems to kill the grasses a little better. Don't have a lot of leftover in the middle of the plot. That's what I mean by the additional control by tank mixing Saline Max or Fusilade with that treatment to alleviate the problem. However, if you do have a lot of grasses look really thick that you are concerned with, I always recommend you do a separate strip of Roundup Power Max or higher rate of generic Roundup, because those generic Roundup is has less active ingredient per gallon. In most of the cases, you need to bump up the use rate. But I always recommend you do a Roundup Power Max or Roundup alone by itself if possible. I'll be happy to entertain any questions. If you send your question to me via text or call me or send email, there are a lot of ways to find me. And again, I appreciate Dr. Graham and Dr. Smith's invitation for speaking to you
about PGRs and our harvest age.
Thank you, Scott. I have two topics that I'm going to address, and I'm probably going to hit only the high points and particularly speed through PGRs. Normally we talk about cotton growth and development, but we're obviously at mid-season, and so we're looking at big cotton. I'm going to make a few comments about PGRs. They've been around an extremely long time, and we have a lot of familiarity. And so we've sort of established how we want to use the products. PICS was the original product, which I think everyone still refers to PGRs as PICS, regardless of whether it's that brand name or not. But 40 years in the marketplace, a lot of use. Initially, the price was probably approaching or just over $100 a gallon. Now you can purchase generic products well less than $10 a gallon. So the use patterns are very much entrenched, but clearly methylquat chloride has become a very valuable tool in managing modern cotton as we grow cotton today, irrigated or dry land for that matter. In terms of mode of action, there are a lot of hormones that affect plant growth that control the different aspects of plant growth. Methylquat chloride actually inhibits a plant hormone, gibberellic acid, that affects tissue elongation or expansion. So that is the actual mode of action. It inhibits a full expansion of cells both in leaves and in the stem tissue. And ultimately, you have a more compact plant because you reduce leaf area as well as stem or internode lengths. There are a lot of reported effects on the label. In essence, they may not directly impact yield, but they do enable us to manage the crop and keep a more compact plant that will facilitate some things and again, may have an indirect improvement in crop yield. If we think about the products that are available, the initial PICS, as we know it, was a 4.2% product, methylquat chloride, and most everything we talk about is of the same nature, though we see some enhanced formulations either with bacterium or with various hormones. Again, many products, but we would lump most of the products together based on the AI per gallon. The one product stance is a little different. It has a little more than double the same AI of methylquat chloride, but it also has another plant growth regulator, that is cycloanilide. And so we treat it and use it in a little different fashion, but we lump all the others together when we think about rate. In terms of use patterns, we're going to use them early and mid and sometimes late. But the different rates, you can see the different rates on this chart. There is a 30-day pre-harvest interval for all the products. Note the actual maximum use rate or total season-long use rate with methylquat chloride the label rate is 48 ounces. On stance, that is 22 ounces per acre per season. Again, the common use patterns we might initiate at or just prior to first bloom at rates as you see here, or we may initiate it early to mid square stage. We have all sorts of levels that we use, but you see the various rates. In terms of stance, we're not talking about rates of 8 to 16 or 24 ounces. We're really talking about 2 to 3 ounces and possibly up to 4 ounces, but so we use a much lower rate with stance. The general thought with stance is that we're going to see a little more forgiving application. We're not likely to shut down the plant and restrict its growth too much. There's also some thought that maybe we get a little more blocky plant established with stance use. Many folks might use stance early and then switch to alternative other methylquat products in later in the season. A few quick points, and I won't touch on all these, but a good fruit set is really the best way to limit vegetative growth. As you get into the reproductive stage, if you're setting bolls effectively, you're going to have less tendency towards rank growth. That's not always an absolute truth, but in general, we want to see good fruit set to hold the plant back. Another point to make is once we've already got a big plant, we can't shrink it down with growth regulators. So we have to deal with it as the crop grows. There are a lot of ways to think about timing and so forth, but some would think of aggressive fertility, aggressive irrigation, or good growing conditions would really accelerate growth, whereas the Meploquat would provide a break. It's kind of like that, but not altogether an easy way, or not a quick way to high yields with high fertility. I would say in general we want to think about timing and rate, but particularly about rate. We've got to look at the current and pending weather forecasts. We have to think about crop growth, and that's going to mean variety, fertility, field history, irrigation, rainfall, etc. We'd also think about the factors on the right as well when we consider how much should we use, how early should we initiate application. And this is probably the most important thing to discuss here. As a particular producer has his program in mind, I'm going to put 8 ounces, or I'm going to put 12 or 16 ounces early bloom or just before bloom, and then follow up with X, Y, or Z. I think the most important thing to consider is, all right, with my standard program, with my standard approach, should I decrease, should I be more aggressive, or should I be less aggressive? Things that might encourage me to be less aggressive, or maybe even to delay an application altogether if I have extremely high temperature or we're facing a drought. Now, over the last week to 10 days, we certainly have gone from moderate temperatures to high temperatures with high humidity. So in the absence of rainfall, there's a lot of stress out there that would encourage me to not make an application or to be a little more conservative. The last couple of days I've been in the Gulf Coast, I've been in central or south central Alabama. I've seen very good growing conditions, but Dr. Smith and Dr. Graham visited the wiregrass area yesterday and said, hey, it's extremely dry there. So those are some factors. If you see these issues, you're going to be more conservative or not at all, or maybe delay an application. On the other hand, if we have extremely good growing conditions, good rainfall, good soil moisture, or we have good irrigation and we know we have an aggressive variety, we might bump up our application rates and frequency and so forth. So again, this is the thought process as you approach the use in a given season. You've got to make in-season adjustments to do the right thing to affect overall growth. Some of the factors we might think about in terms of initiating timing would be a lot of things that you see here. When we think about, particularly when we get to first bloom, if I'm 5 or 6 nodes above white flower at first bloom, that means I need cotton to grow. So I'm probably not going to make an application. On the other hand, if I'm at 8 or 9 nodes above white flower, certainly an application is warranted, and I might even bump it up if rainfall and soil moisture are quite good. Another way to think about this is to look at a plant, and this is probably an in-season, maybe a secondary and third applications. If we go between the 4th node and the 5th node down, and we look at that internode length, and the reason we were looking at that one is because that's the node at which the most recent full expansion should have occurred. When that distance and that internode distance exceeds maybe 2.5 to 3 inches, and some folks may say three fingers or whatever, we probably need to make an application. When it gets tighter than that, if it's just 2 inches clipping along, maybe I hold off an application another few days. A few quick finishing thoughts. How rain fast is methylquat chloride? Most of the labels say it's going to take 8 hours. If we add a surfactant, we probably improve that to 4 hours. What about tank mixtures? In my mind and experience, methylquat products are extremely friendly with tank mixtures. We rarely see issues there in terms of burn or foliar damage and so forth. So a very benign product as we think about it as a tank mix partner with other products. What about late season applications? They definitely make cotton look pretty. Most of the small plot research show that they do not increase yield, but ultimately they make cotton, maybe make cotton a little more pickable, a little more easy to defoliate, but the yield advantage is not necessarily what drives that application. All right, let me switch gears to talk about harvest aids. And really, we might class this as defoliants, but it really are harvest aids because we're doing different functions. But we want to take cotton that looks like this and push it to this, and ultimately get it in the bale and deliver it to the gin with as high a quality as possible. We help that along with our harvest aid products. They have a specific purposes. They do different things for us. There are different couple of mode of actions that we recognize, particularly with our defoliant products. And then we have the issues that we would consider when should we make an application, and then a lot of other considerations as we look at it. I'm not going to give you an exact prescription. That's always tweaked in season, but we'll talk about some of the factors that might influence and guide our thinking as we make choices. But in terms of the purpose and function, we're really trying to accelerate what's going to happen naturally. Leaves are going to fall off ultimately, bowls are going to open, but we really want to accelerate that to improve our harvest efficiency, to remove or to diminish or to minimize the amount of foliage or plant material that moves through a picker. A big thing, and particularly as it focuses on bowl opening, we're going to expedite once over harvest. And again, the ultimate goal is to deliver as good a quality product to the gin as possible. I might also add on a more formal basis that to satisfy contracts, most of them have language that suggests the chemical defoliation is a requirement. In terms of the functions of the harvest aid products, I think of 4 main functions. There are others. We want to remove mature leaves. We want to be able to remove juvenile or immature leaves, and secondarily, maybe juvenile fruit. A big thing we want to do, particularly as we're in more humid and warmer climates, we want to inhibit regrowth. And then another major factor that we've been using and employing since probably the early 1980s is to use these to facilitate once over harvest with bowl opening. We might do some other things. We might achieve a little grass control in some environments, not particularly ours, but we might think about desiccation, but that's not a big choice for us. In terms of mode of action, as I've mentioned, we're accelerating natural processes. Really, the abscission layer is a layer of cells that forms at the attachment of the petiole or the leaf stalk to the leaf blade to the branch and so forth. I maybe should show it by picture. This is the leaf blade here, and this is another leaf blade here. The stalk of the leaf blade is called a petiole, and at this junction is what we're trying to affect here. There can be a formation of cells there that form a little layer we call the abscission layer. This is the same picture but more close up. It is this layer that we're trying to affect. That is where the abscission layer forms, and it's controlled and regulated by plant hormones produced in the leaf blade and moves down this, and that's where we affect it. This is the same site, and the petiole is out of focus, but we've snapped it right at this point, and we achieve that because that by defoliation products we cause the abscission layer to form, and that drops right off. Again, not a great picture on the petiole, but there it is. But the abscission cells are right there, and that's what we're affecting with our products. This is another leaf, again, a little fuzzy, but the petiole has snapped from this point right there. Again, that's what we're trying to achieve. We're trying to expedite that, make that happen faster than it might happen otherwise. Now, this is interesting, just a side point, but the stalk of this is the petiole for that leaf here, but at this point, this is the stalk of the bowl. We don't call that a petiole, we call it the peduncle. But interestingly, when we put on a harvest aid product that affects the abscission layer here, we don't do the same on the bowls, otherwise the bowls would fall off. Once a small bowl is about 10 days old, this connection here is firm enough that it is rare, extremely rare for it to come off It happens, but it's very unusual. So we're not creating an abscission layer for the boll, thankfully. We are affecting boll opening, and that's an important function of what we're trying to achieve with harvest aids. In terms of mode of action, we think of particularly the defoliant products. They have herbicidal effects or they have hormonal effects. The herbicidal products, they injure plant tissues, and that does have an impact on hormonal balance and maybe impacts what we see with the other products, that is ethylene production, which is a ripening agent, but they're more about plant injury. And the common products that we think about would be Folex, and the other, DEF is an old product, PPO herbicide or PPO products like AIM, ET. Maybe there's some others, Blizzard and Balance have been in the marketplace that might do the same. And another one that we would consider a herbicidal product would be Diuron. Of the hormonal products, we think of Didazuron. The original initial product was Drop. There are many brand names and generic names there, TDZ even. Excuse me. And then we have Ethifon, which is what we're using primarily as a boll opener, but it's a very, very good defoliant too. The initial product was Prep. There are many others now. We also would talk about Finish, which contains Ethifon, but another PGR called cycloanilid, which is one of the things one of the actives that we saw in the growth regulator stance. I might also mention that in addition to tank mixtures of the different products, we also have many combination products. For example, we would have Diuron mixed with Thidazuron, and that's going to be the initial brand name was Genstar. And so there are a lot of combination products out there as well, particularly, again, with Finish and cycloanilid would be another. Now, one point to make with the herbicidal products, if we use, particularly when temperatures are too high, if we use elevated rates or too aggressive rates, rather than injure the plant in a minor way to create the abscission layer, we may create such a rapid injury, we may get desiccation or leaf stick, and that creates trash in the picker, trash in the gin. Pin trash would often be common. So that's an adverse thing. If we get too aggressive with our rates, it's not a good thing, particularly with the herbicidal products. Now, when should we make the applications? A lot of ways to make that determination. One of the traditional statements would be at 60% open, or some folks may use 70% open. You can assess that on your pickup truck, riding by at 60 miles an hour. I will say last year I had some fields that I estimated, and then I did the actual counts, and I was a little high with my estimate because I had a number of bolls on vegetative branches that really brought my percentage down. I will throw out at this point, a number of years ago, I was involved in a study at which we initiated harvest aid application at 10% open, and then did so on a weekly basis. And the results were kind of surprising. It was not that detrimental to go early. And I think more often in the Southeast, we go a little too late. We go later than we possibly could. But again, most people are going to be 60 or 70% open. Another common method that I would suggest is the node above crack bowl technique, which if you have a first position bowl that's open, if you count 5 nodes above that, and sometimes it might be 6, those bowls are going to be sufficiently mature that you can make the application without reducing yield or fiber quality. Now, the one I like most, and I would use this in the whole in the big way, in the big scheme, is what I call a cut and confirm, but others would call it the sharp knife technique. But the goal there is to kind of confirm, is this bowl mature enough to proceed without a problem? And this sort of demonstrates the cut and confirm. If you go to a field and say, well, this is probably the last harvestable bowl that I want, if you try to slice it, if it's extremely difficult to slice, it's probably mature and ready to go. If you can slice it, this layer of this is a cross section of seed, obviously, and it starts out clear, and then it turns to yellow, brown, and then black. The darker it gets, the more mature it is. So this one's too young, but as it turns brown or so, as it gets darker, it's plenty mature to proceed. So let me back up and just say I think that's a valuable way to confirm all the other approaches that we would use. But a grower also has to think about his labor, his harvest capacity, and pending weather. Excuse me. In terms of the products, the pre-harvest interval for most of those is either 5 or 7 days. In most of our situations, bowl opening is probably what is delaying our process of proceeding or moving to harvest. That's what we're waiting on. Leaf drop is going to be very not complete, but it's going to be advanced probably from day 4 to day 5 or 6 or 7. Bowl opening is really what's going to drive this bus at that time. Now, what about pending weather? The immediate forecast, what happens in the next 3 to 5 or 6 days after an application probably can influence weather negatively, particularly if we see a significant change in a decrease in temperature or if we get a heavy rain. I think that's going to reduce the performance of the application we make. Now, in terms of rain fastness, and some of this may be related to rain fastness of product, the thiodiazuron products are very slow in plant uptake. They may require 24 hours. We may see 6 hours for some of the other ethylene products. And then the PPO, some of the PPOs and then some of the phosphates, we may say they're rain fast within an hour. We can affect that by additives. For example, Dr. Lee talked about ammonium sulfate. Ammonium sulfate can enhance the uptake of thiodiazuron. And even, I know some have used successfully the phosphates in combination with other products to accelerate uptake. So there's some ways we can help that along, particularly when we're using thiodiazuron. In terms of temperature, consider 60 degrees as a benchmark. As temperatures fall below that, the thiodiazuron products are going to lose some of their effectiveness. But just another quick couple of points about what to do with a coming storm or coming freeze. Well, sometimes when a storm's coming, you do things you probably wouldn't do otherwise. And I'll just give an extreme example. I remember a couple of years ago when Hurricane Michael was approaching, I had a consultant friend and he was advising his growers to go get it. And one grower said, well, look, it's not quite ready. Well, if he didn't pick the cotton, it went from maybe 1,500 pound to less than 400 pound cotton. So sometimes with a coming storm, you may do something a little unusual. Maybe more significant and more applicable is to think about a coming freeze. If a freeze is 2 days out or hey, it's going to freeze tomorrow night and I've still got bowls that I need to open, that's probably too late. You probably need at least 4 or 5 days to start that process of bowl opening. And again, that's maybe a loose gauge, but don't think if it's going to freeze tomorrow night, then I'm going to help myself by going out with a high rate of ethylene. Now, I say buy local in terms of recommendation because it's, as Dr. Smith alluded to earlier, Alabama is extremely diverse. I guess I would say one generalization as we move in the southern half and as we make our harvest aid applications where we face significant regrowth pressure, thiodiazuron is going to be a much more important play than maybe in the extreme or more northerly parts where maybe they don't have quite as much regrowth pressure. That's just a gross generalization, but you know what works in your area and rates and trends is what I would follow. I would say it would be valuable to follow, to observe performance as you move into this season. Is it a year when it's hard to get the leaves off, or hey, the leaves are just jumping off, or the bowls are not opening well? So you factor those things in as you make applications, and you should get smarter today than you were a few days prior. You do make adjustments as the season progresses, and generally that means that it's going to be cooler weather, so your rates move up a little bit, particularly with your defoliant products and maybe your bowl opening products. So again, it's a work in progress, and you adjust as the season moves along. I would make this point emphatically that even the best defoliant product, and if we compared it, using it at the highest rate, if we compared that to using a product, a 2- and 3-way combination with multiple modes of action, we typically see far more consistent performance and more effective results when we make combinations. A couple of finishing points here. We can get by sometimes with a lesser approach, but if we get so cheap that it doesn't work, and if we have to retreat, it really costs us time and money. And probably when we're thinking about cotton picking, the time part is the greater expense than the money. A few other considerations and concepts I'll just touch on. We think about rates and application as we think about how aggressive our crop is at the time, what the calendar date is, but the regrowth pressure out there, the fertility, the moisture situation, all those are going to affect our rate choices. We've talked about trends in weather and threats. In terms of yield potential, and I'll cut this 2 ways. One, if we have a crop that, say, it's early September and it's been so dry that we don't have much of a crop, we got a couple of bowls that we might could pick, but the crop's hanging on, maybe we just sit back and wait and don't do anything. Conversely, and I'll use the other extreme, if we have an extremely good crop, maybe it pays to do a little more, to spend the money to make sure we get a very, very good defoliation and good bowl opening so that we capture all that we can. What about 2 shots versus 2 applications versus 1? If you told me you were going to commit to 2, I think I could almost say you can do a near perfect job almost every time. But I think normally you want to approach it with a single application and touch it up only if absolutely necessary. Calendar date would drive some things. If your first or average frost day is, let's say, November 5, and here we are at November 10th or 12th, and we haven't seen a frost, and we still got some bowls that need to be open, maybe I go ahead and proceed rather than gambling and waiting. So calendar date's going to drive some things as well, and maybe make you speed things along. Obviously, each farmer has to think about logistics and what he can get to with, and not get too far advanced or not be behind. There's nothing worse than having a picker sitting idle because you don't have the cotton ready. So all that's got to be factored in. And then we face the situations where we don't achieve perfection, but perfection is not always essential. But I think you got to work with your ginner and see what goes in the module, and then sees what happens at the gin to sometimes make that call. But I've seen situations that aren't perfect that it was okay to proceed. But again, use some caution and common sense, and maybe get some help from your ginner as you make that call. I'll finish up with the subject about the extraneous matter, and specifically one that is bark. Bark is an extraneous call at the classing office. It's done by the human eyes, not the machines. But it's, again, it's an external matter or extraneous factor that degrades or suffers significant penalties in the marketplace. In the U.S. crop last year, about 5% of the crop had level 1 bark. There's a level 1, and a level 2. Level 2 is worse. In Alabama, we had just under 27,000 bales that had level 1 bark. That's a little less than 3% of the crop. Bark is a function normally of weathering. As you get to November, you see cold weather, you're going to see the stalk degrade. We can see that happen as a result of plant pathogens, some of our diseases, our nematodes. We can see that create some degradation of plant tissues that are going to lead to increase in bark. And you see that clearly as the harvest season progresses. I might also add, and I'm not a picker expert, but aggressive picker setup, pressure plates, speeds can create a more aggressive approach, and you can see the spindle damage on the stalk, and sometimes that can contribute. I'll show a couple of pictures, but all this, the reason I would include this in a discussion on harvest aid usage is because the timeliness of harvest aid application and then harvest helps to minimize or reduce this threat. And just a couple of pictures to show On the right, maybe you can see where a picker has been through here and chewed up the stalk. And you can see a close-up here as these little fragments are shredded. They can get in the gin, or they can get in the cotton, seed cotton sample, and then get to the gin. And again, we see penalties from that in the classing office. So let me stop there, and if you have questions, I'd be happy to address them and provide any information I can to help you. Thank you.
I appreciate the opportunity to be with you all today. I'm just going to give a quick agronomic update for the Tennessee Valley, and then kind of get into some key weeds that we see. Some of that will be some overlap with what Dr. Steve Lee had presented, hopefully not too much, but just getting to touch on a little bit of everything. In the past, it covered some weeds that we commonly see in the Tennessee Valley and some other parts of the state as well. And then also just want to show some recent field calls and some things we've been alerted to that hopefully those watching can alert us to as well, or just be on the lookout for and kind of keep in mind as we progress forward through the season and even into next year. Quickly, just for a Tennessee Valley update, things overall here look pretty good. I will say we're a little bit more delayed than what we typically are, especially with our cotton crop. We did have some earlier planted cotton, but had some really cool weather early on that persisted, so we had some later planted cotton. But even with cotton that was timely planted, or even maybe a touch late, that cooler weather still persisted. So we didn't have a lot of blooms by the 4th of July. We pushed a little bit later into bloom. Really, the last couple of weeks, we've really pushed into bloom, so a little bit further behind than what we typically would be. However, the crop looks pretty good. We've caught very timely rains. There's some that could use a little more rain at this time as we're in bloom. And if we can have one or two more to finish that off. And most places, the corn crop ought to be really good. One thing I also mentioned as far as wheat harvest, that was one period, and I think folks were surprised pleasantly to the good for the most part. We had a really wet winter, and very few days to make any kind of applications in our wheat. I would say most growers had a total of maybe 4 to 5 days at most to do anything in the field that were zero, that did not help our overall averages. However, there were a lot of good results as far as wheat, and we didn't hamper some of those yields as bad as we thought we would have. And most of our variety trial results have been sent out, and those are obviously going to be put in some better places in the field, so those will inflate some yields. However, if you've had a chance to look at those, you can see some of those plots had some really good, really high yields. And again, I think growers are surprised to the good this year, even with the wet weather that we had and the lack of time to get in the field. I haven't mentioned soybeans. Early season soybeans look pretty good with all the early rain that we've had. And again, with all those crops, we've got a ways to go. So we're going to try to hold on and see what we can do there and hopefully get the weather that we need. Pest pressure wise, thrips were not terrible this year. Some places worse than others. Surprised they didn't jump on us a little harder with some of that cooler weather that we had. Plant bug pressure has overall been light, some heavier infestations in some fields, but overall has been pretty light. And again, a lot of getting into our bloom period here, a lot of diamond has gone out in the last week or two, maybe mixed with an adulticide as well, to help control those immatures and clean up any adults that may be left in the field. So we're pushing forward here in the next couple of weeks, scouting for bollworms and stink bugs and seeing where we are with that. Getting into some of our key weeds, I want to talk about 3 weeds really. This is not exhaustive by any means. We could go in depth with several more, but ones that we get alerted to, ones that have recently gotten field calls on. The first one, and it's not going anywhere, and it's no surprise, is Palmer amaranth. Dr. Steve Lee, again, talked about that in great detail. I also want to mention Dr. David Russell, who's not with us today, is housed here as well. We've got 2 great extension weed scientists, and privileged to be able to work with both of them and get to do some things with them. So reach out to them, reach out to us for any needs that you have. Going into Palmer amaranth, most of us are very aware of what it looks like. We've dealt with the heartburn and the difficulty that comes with managing this weed. we look at Palmer versus other pigweed species. There's no leaf, there's no hairs on the leaves. Waxy leaves, if you turn them upside down, a lot of times they have a shiny sheen to them. Diamond-shaped leaf. If you take that petiole and bend it over the leaf, it's typically going to be longer than the leaf. And then you've got that rosette growth pattern in the seed head. Looks like the long lizard tail. Pretty unmistakable. Most of us have seen it and know what it looks like and how difficult to control it is. And these things, can grow up to an inch a day, rapidly growing, which makes them a really challenge to control. This photo will just show a lot of differences there in the Palmer, different characteristics. You can see the small ones and just the plethora that are just germinating there in the seed bank. And we talk about seed bank control being a key to managing Palmer. We'll get into that in a minute. But you see the various shapes, sizes there, and just the sheer number of seed that plant can produce, which really makes it difficult to control. Another thing, when we were early on in the Palmer resistance era, a lot of people would say, well, I don't have Palmer, I've got red root or smooth pigweed. And that may have been true. But if you've ever had resistant Palmer in a field and also have maybe red root or smooth, the Palmer has the ability to cross with these species. And then if you've got resistant Palmer and these other species in the field and they cross, you immediately get resistant offspring. So you can look and see that some here do not have the typical Palmer characteristics. Some in there would look like smooth leaf or red root, but every one of those pigweed are resistant. They're all right there in the same field. They've all crossed with one another with a resistant Palmer, and so you've got resistant offspring in that field. Moving forward to some field calls this year, recently in the last month or so. Hopefully this is not the beginning of this, but with what we've been through in the past, very well could be, and hopefully not. Just want folks to be aware, be on the lookout. Tennessee's already seeing some of this in some other areas as well. Again, Dr. Lee mentioned we don't know what the status of our Dicamba is next year, or auxin technology. And if we have it, I hope we do. But if we do have it, we need to steward those products very well. We got alerted to a couple of fields that Dicamba was not working particularly well. This is an application here in a cotton field. We're looking at really small Palmer, and that's just several days after the application, or maybe a week or so after application, and we're not doing very well there as far as control. Typically we think about larger Palmer being difficult to control, and that is the case. But when we see these smaller ones that we're not controlling well with our Dicamba applications, it's of particular concern. It's another shot of that field where we actually see some of the larger carcasses that were terminated or were killed, and some of the smaller ones there that are not. So again, just be on the lookout for that. Hopefully that's not incurring the beginnings of resistance, but the way some of these products are being used, I have a great concern. We'll talk about keys to success in just a minute, as Dr. Lee did, but wanted to show those photos and folks to be aware of that. In Tennessee, this photo next is courtesy of Dr. Larry Steckel. That is a photo in Tennessee in a plot where that is the second application of 22 ounces of XtendoMax 14 days after application. So you got two applications, and that's 14 days after, and that's what those are looking like. So hopefully we're not going from what we just saw in the previous photos to that, but just want to bring some awareness in some of the recent field calls. We have collected samples, have sent them off. We'll be determining what's going on there in those fields. When we talk about Palmer and many weeds for sure, but especially Palmer, starting clean with a good burn down is essential. Dr. Lee talked about how important residuals are behind the planter. Whether we have Dicambas next year or not, residuals are very key. And I know it's a tough market. Margins are tight. I've gotten to visit several fields where folks are not using residuals behind the planter. And I would just plead with you to please do that. Please use residuals, because those fields we're visiting where they're looking at a Dicamba alone approach or something else alone approach simply is not working. It's a mess. And at the same time, we're putting a lot of pressure on those Dicamba products from a resistance standpoint, even if we do get to have them next year. So he mentioned many things that we can use behind the planter in cotton. There's other things we can use in soybeans as well. As far as residuals and timely burn downs and going behind the planter. Timeliness is everything. The larger we let those palmer get, the larger we let those weeds get, the more difficult they're going to be to control. Coverage is going to be key. I think most everybody's on board with this at this point, but we need a minimum of 15 gallons of water when we're applying, trying to make an application on palmer. And that's whether we're using Liberty, a follow-up type material after our Dicamba, or even our Dicamba is a minimum of 15 GPA. And it's one thing I will mention as far as Liberty goes. Those fields where we've had those problems and had those grower field calls about Dicamba not working well. In cotton, Liberty following Dicamba 5 to 7 days after has cleaned all those fields up luckily. So we don't have escapes there beyond what we saw initially. And used in conjunction with one another, Liberty followed by Dicamba has done a very good job. But we need that coverage as well. I'm going to talk about one that nobody wants to use. They're aggravating, they're difficult, and that's hooded sprayers. But they can really be a game changer if you've got them and you've got problems. They can go a long way into cleaning up your crop and in your cotton especially. So just want to mention that with hooded sprayers. Folks have, I think somebody coined the term, really gotten used to cruising in the left lane with just the Dicamba alone approach. And again, we would caution you against that and hopefully not do that. There's a lot that are not doing that, thankfully, but those that are, we want to use residuals, be timely. If you've got hooded sprayers, use those. Shade is your friend. If we can shade out those, whether we're in soybeans and get them to canopy, keep those soybeans clean and canopy, or in cotton, get to lap the middles, and that's where those hooded sprayers would come into play as well. Shade really helps us as far as controlling our palmer. It's evident in corn and the corn crop as well. Managing fence rows and ditch banks and hand pulling escapes, those are both critical. It's easy to ride by and let those slip past. When you've got a plant that can produce 500,000 seed, really it builds a seed bank in a hurry. So we want to take a zero tolerance approach whenever possible. Moving on, one we've talked about for several years, even talked about in our winter grower meetings last year's Italian ryegrass or annual ryegrass. Continuing to get calls on this, continuing to have more problems with this. Dr. Dave Russell's received calls this year as well. And we talk about it every year. It's one that it's hard to forget about, or easy to forget about, one that we don't think about a lot till we're having a problem, especially in our corn crops. Mississippi Delta has dealt with this problem for some time. We've got some glyphosate-resistant annual ryegrass or Italian ryegrass. When we identify it, you can see the seed head there, those large clasping auricles, and a real waxy type leaf. So that's Italian ryegrass or annual ryegrass. I want to rewind to a cornfield. This is back in 2015 in North Alabama. And we're seeing more and more of this every year. That's obviously a worst case scenario. But the longer we let this thing creep in, the longer we go untreated, the more we're going to start seeing these problems, I'm afraid. Not trying to be an alarmist, but this is one we can get ahead of. It doesn't spread in the way that palmer does. And we can use some products in a way that we can really get a hold on this thing, but it really doesn't seem to be addressed a lot. In recent years, timing can be difficult. This year didn't do us any favor with the cool weather that we had early season, and we just kept getting germinating ryegrass and persisting. But when we get to this point in our corn crop, on the photo that you see there, that particular field had over 3 applications of glyphosate, over 100 ounces applied. Resistant, we're not controlling it, and once it comes up in your corn at that point, it's pretty well game over. There's not a lot you can do about it. So to help combat that, we've done several trials. We'll talk about that, but not only is it particularly troublesome in corn and other crops, it can be competitive in other crops like cotton and soybeans, but in corn, there's an allelopathic effect, which means there's basically a toxic effect to our corn. And if we don't burn that ryegrass down, whether it's resistant or not, it doesn't even have to be glyphosate resistant. If we're not burning down at least a month ahead, Mississippi's got some data to show, if not 50 days ahead, that ryegrass can still contribute to yield loss in our corn. So we attempted to mimic a trial that they've done in the past where we burned down at various timing frequencies to determine what kind of allelopathic or toxic effect that has to the corn. This is an artificial population that we sowed. So just want to put that on your radar on some things that we're investigating. But not only that, I want to show if you have glyphosate resistant ryegrass, the center of the photo there, that's our untreated check. We didn't terminate that until our lay-by overpass to simulate what it would be like to have glyphosate-resistant ryegrass during the growing season that you couldn't control. You can obviously see those rows of corn there are very adversely affected versus the ones on the left and the right that were burned down in a timely manner. So again, we've got glyphosate-resistant ryegrass. It's starting to spread, and we're having trouble with that. More and more calls every year. But two, even if it's not resistant, if we don't burn it down timely, we can contribute to yield loss in our corn crops and have a competitive effect in our corn and our cotton and soybean crops. We've got clethodim, like our Select Maxes or our section type products. Problem with those is that in cotton and soybeans, we're putting a lot of pressure on that. There is documented clethodim resistance in Mississippi and Tennessee, so we're putting a lot of pressure there. And in corn, the problem is that usually when we discover our glyphosate or our Roundup's not working, clethodim at a full rate, which we need to really control that, there's a 30-day plant back in corn, and most of us don't have that kind of time at that point. So the real answer would be fall control. And it's a time that's tough to hit. Weather's not always favorable, and a lot of other things are going on. But that ryegrass can germinate anytime from typically late October, early November, all the way up through January. So if you can go out right as it germinates, and a lot of times a good time to start looking for that's right around the week of Thanksgiving. We have had as late a germination, depending on weather, is early January. You can go out, bang for your buck. What we found with 32 to 40 ounces of paraquat or gramoxone plus a pint to a pint and a third of metolachlor, dual magnum, generic dual, will go a long way into cleaning that seed bank up and getting early control. And that's what you see in those plots there is paraquat or gramoxone mixed with a residual at that fall timing just as it emerged. And that's fast forwarded into like that March time frame. And that's not to say you'll have no ryegrass to contend with that burned down, but you would be contending with an untreated like you see in those strips that are really big, really hard to control versus almost the tabletop clean that you see in those burned down strips that were done in the fall. And plus you go a long way to clean up that seed bank to other weeds as well. Again, tough timing to hit sometimes, but with the more and more calls we're getting, especially in our corn crops where we can't control the resistance issues that we're having, fall control option would be best. One watch out would be erosion on some of our rolling soils and terrain. If you go with that fall timing, we can get into some erosion problems, but you can pick your poison, so to speak. I'm not saying it's for every acre, but if you've got fields with a history of ryegrass that's troublesome and difficult to control, this would be an excellent way to do that. Also, you just want to mention briefly that if you find your back against the wall in a corn crop where you burned down, you've planted your corn, and your corn isn't up yet, or maybe you're about to go plant your corn, you're in the week of planting, and you realize that your glyphosate's not working or you've got resistance, you can go out with paraquat and a group 5 herbicide like atrazine. So atrazine plus paraquat is what that photo showed. We went with 40 to 48 ounces of gramoxone and a quart of atrazine. Those two products together will have a synergistic effect and a good kill on that ryegrass, approximately 90% or so there. So if you find yourself in that situation, that's one avenue you can take. But again, just want to highlight that weed as it continues to be a problem and be on the lookout for. Moving on, one I think throughout the state where and Dr. Lee talked about this as well, is goosegrass. Somewhere we're seeing some glyphosate resistance too, probably and potentially, and also the antagonism that he mentioned. Just as far as identification characteristics, you can see there on your screen, it's tough. It's a clump summer annual flat stem, whitish silver color there in the center of the crown. Sometimes you can have some leaf hairs near the base, and that spikelet type seed head that you'll see in the next photo. A lot of times we think about it as a turf weed. If you run a weed eater in and you try to clean that up around your fence rows, you find out real quick when you got goosegrass that wears you out and it whips that weed eater back, and have a lot of difficulty there. It is a tough weed. It's tough to get coverage on, tough to control in general, but becoming more of a problem. Just want to alert to a field call about 10 days ago. This is in Madison County, where in a ditch bank on a roadside, we've got some goosegrass there. That's after 2 applications of half a pound of Dicamba and a quart of Roundup. And again, Dr. Lee mentioned the antagonism that can take place, but I think we may be dealing with some plain old glyphosate resistance here as well. We took samples. They're going to be sent off for testing. And again, if you can go Roundup alone or maybe Roundup tank mixed with a clethodim type product, do a lot better job than the 2-way mix of the Roundup plus Dicamba. But again, that was sprayed approximately a month ago with the first shot of Roundup and Dicamba product. And then about 7 days ago with after that photo was taken with another shot of Roundup Dicamba. So we're obviously having some issues there. It's not widespread in the field, but another one to be on the lookout for. These grass crops or grass weeds can really choke out a crop and are becoming more of a problem and more troublesome that we need to be on the lookout for. All right, one that maybe particularly we don't scout for a whole lot. I want to talk about shifting gears a little bit and can be a silent yield robber. It's something we'll talk about now. If you look at these 2 photos, I'll fast forward to the next photo where you can see some signs of potash deficiency. Back to these 2 photos. All these fields have an underlying condition, an underlying problem. One of these fields does have some nematodes that are contributing to that, which especially makes that challenging. But what I'm talking about is compaction. That's something that a lot of times we may not scout for, but is a silent yield robber and starting to come across in more and more fields. The field there on the left is one that Dr. Steve Brown and myself and others visited last week. And at first look, it looks like you've got some nematodes going on in that cotton. He even released in the Alabama Crops Report, a newsletter that we've mentioned, a write-up about that here this week. And it looks like nematodes may be there. But upon further investigation, they were dealing with a hard pan, compaction layer. And if you move to the field on the right, we did take nematode samples there, separate field, separate location, nematodes in that field, but also severe compaction going on there. I want to talk about the compaction for a minute. Sometimes different parts of the state we talk about are very diverse. Some parts have a true plow pan where there's been a shallow disc or something like that, and you've got a hard pan. There's other parts of the state, like where we are in the Tennessee Valley, you've got some fields that have been no-tilled and conservation tilled for some time, which I'm in favor of. We develop an upper compaction layer in the upper 2 to 4 inches of the soil. Sometimes if we can bust through that, we do a pretty good job, and it's in that upper level. Other places it's deeper. But nonetheless, we need to find a way to combat that, and there are several ways we can do that. Again, I showed this photo talking about some of the potash deficiency that's already been shown in that cotton crop. That's a field that one of our agents, John Vanderford, and myself visited last week as well. And when you scout for that using a penetrometer, you don't have to have something this fancy. But this is a penetrometer. Basically, you can have a rod or whatever you want to use to find out where that hard layer is in your field. This one will give you an indication on where root limiting compaction is. It's where 300 is on that gauge. Be kind of difficult to see, but it's pretty simple to scout for, but is one that we continue to see problems on. I know Eddie McGriff's made several tweets about this as well in fields that he's walked. Going to one of those grower fields that Dr. Brown and myself visited, they took us to another one of their fields. And almost to the line, you can see cotton's a little more robust, growing a lot better here. They had run a ripper roller on a diagonal in that field, and you can see where that cotton is growing so much better than this cotton here, where they weren't able to run it. And again, that is one method we can use to alleviate some of that compaction. I want to use that as a quick lead-in to some other options. So when we talk about that ripper roller, depending on what part of the state you're in, you may use strip tillage, you may use a ripper roller, you may use in-row subsoiling on a GPS. I'm a fan as much conservation tillage as possible. I don't want to disgruntle any of our NRCS friends by any means. To me, no till to me doesn't mean never till. But if we can really disrupt that hard layer, whether it's in the upper or lower through some deep tillage with minimal impact on the surface, I think is the answer. And coupling with that with a good cover crops program that is unique to your area of the state. This is something that we did last fall here at the Tennessee Valley Research Extension Center. It's the KMC Ripper Roller. A little more upper disturbance than we wanted to see. But what we've done, this field is a 10-acre field here that we've split with cover and no cover for about the last 4 years. And we ran that on a diagonal. Last year is the first year we ran it. And there are a lot of fields, I think, where we could do this one time and help jumpstart a cover crop program and maybe never have to do it again for another 10 years or even longer. Other parts of the state, if your soils are more prone to seal off every year, sandier tight with some loams in there, you may have to do it more frequently. But nonetheless, just wanted to point out what that can do and even couple with a good cover crop program. So we've took various readings with that penetrometer in this field. And again, this area of the field has remained fallow for some time now. This area has been cover crop for about the last 4 years. So we took early season measurements just after planting with that penetrometer, and the numbers you see on the screen are average depth to that 300 mark or that root limiting compaction. So we're 11.5 inches down here in the fallow, which is actually pretty good for this side of the field. Moisture influences that. We had early season moisture this year, so we're able to go a little deeper than typical. But if you look in the part that was rip and rolled, we're down to 21.5 inches here, 21 inches there. And I want to point out just the cover crop alone that we've grown the last 4 years has helped us alleviate some compaction, hold a little bit more moisture, and go a ways to eliminating some of those compaction problems that we have. We're down to 14 inches there. We couple the two, we're 21 inches. We need to go back now about mid-season and also at the end of season and take readings again as these soils will dry up and seal off sometimes and we're not able to get as deep. But you can see what we've done early season to help get some early root growth out there and help those crops. What you see here is back in the fall when we did that after we drilled across and established our cover crop. And that cover crop is drilled across, and you'll notice even where we rip and roll with the cover, how much better growth and early germination we got out of that. So again, there's multiple methods to go to alleviating compaction. I'm not for a conventional tillage all the time approach. I'm not saying that, but a good cover crop program with some minimal upper disturbance, but deep tillage, once every 5 years, once every 10 years, or what your location determines can go a long way. Because that compaction, in my opinion, is very adversely affecting us in a lot of ways. May have gone over my time, I'm not sure. Those are just some field calls and key issues that I wanted to highlight on and some weeds that we see, and along with the compaction problems we've seen here recently. Glad to entertain any questions or any thoughts anybody has.
Opportunity to be on here with y'all. I know we're going to change gears a little bit here and talk about the peanuts and what we've been seeing here this past year. We certainly increased the acres roughly around 15% to about 170,000 plus acres of peanuts for the state. We had a very challenging year at harvest last year, getting in the crop, which led to some seed issues. So we knew that was going to possibly be a problem. We tried to alleviate that by really getting a lot of tests to see where they were with that, blending some up the seeding rates, plant later when it's warmer. But we still had some places that were some issues, and we had to come back in there and patch in some more seed there in those fields. All in all, we should be okay with the rain that we had there early, getting the crop off to a decent start. So a little bit early to tell how bad we're going to get hit with tomato spotted wilt. We do see some out there. It's obviously worse where you have those skippy stands and delay starting on those peanuts, but we'll see what happens there with that a little later in the season. A lot of the crop is around that 90 days after planting, so the water demand really kicks up on it, and that's something that's been getting very spotted here around lately. It's kind of hard to get 2 inches a week, really what we need everywhere. So that brings me to my next slide. is I want to talk a little bit about the weekly water use there on peanuts. A lot of times these guys will start watering peanuts too early that have irrigation. You know, not everybody has the amount of irrigation water that they need to supply that crop season long. And so many times I see them dumping a lot of water out there, an inch out there per week early, or an inch and a half, and think they're going to help make them grow faster. They really need to be conservative and be mindful of how much that plant actually uses. You know, it's very minimum until you get up to about 60 days of age, and then it starts using more water there until it gets up there, you know, to that 90 to 100 day mark when we really go to using 2 inches a week then. But that's the good thing about peanuts being an indeterminate, and the reason why we have so many dry land acres of them and in these sandy, drouthy soils is to be able to alleviate some of that. And, you know, when conditions ain't favorable, you know, they kind of sit there and wait. Turns around, we go to getting some rain, you get another flush of blooms and go to setting the crop. So a lot more flexibility for us with the peanuts. Here's just a shot I was talking about. When these guys, scouts, are out there in the fields, number one, the first thing we like to look at and check is what kind of plant stand we've got. We obviously shooting for 4 plants per foot out there. And you can see the picture on the left is obviously what we were after. Here's a shot of some twin rows this year, earlier in the year on the right, and we just didn't get an adequate stand. We were very skippy here, so we came back in there and patched in some plants to hopefully fill that gap up to not where we wouldn't give up any yield loss there and leave it on the table. Here's a shot of some there that were skippy, came up there later, and you see a little bit of virus there starting to creep in with those. That's where we really get hit hard, is detrimental to our yields, is getting an early virus that can really cut our yields. Here's a shot here that you can see some late virus that came in. It's not nearly as big an issue as it is when you get those real small plants and that's real skippy, and you get a lot of virus to come into the field, and it's really detrimental to our yield. This is not as bad, but you get caught out to a field like this and you see a lot of skips and gaps in it, and people wonder what happened, you know, what's going on. So that's just virus hits out here. Here's a field the other week I was in Pike County. We run into this more and more, it seems like the last couple of years. You get spots across there, and they wonder what's going on and what's happening. And I put out lime, I've done this and that, but you get these pockets out there where the pH is low. And here you got a pH of about 4 out there. And, you know, you wonder how that happens, but you come to find out they've had it in a hay field or something for years, and then they just started cropping it. And it's just not as uniform throughout. You may see some little pockets. This was a field from last year where some plants had died out there, scattered about in this area right here. The farmer, he noticed the plants were dying. He thought maybe it was seedling disease earlier. Didn't really know there early in the season. So he called me out there later, and they continued to die for a long period of time out there. I got to looking and investigating, and it was low pH. More times you'll see larger areas of the field like this where you don't have any plant stand. And then, of course, what happens a lot of times, you get the pH down there low, zinc will go up, and zinc's very toxic on peanuts, and it kill those peanuts as well. Here's another issue that you might see as you get out there scouting later in the season, and you may see some yellowing out there. Obviously, this is not an inoculation problem. It doesn't follow that kind of pattern. Here, this is in the corner of the field. Typically, you might see a little hot spot out there in the field. And, you know, it could be a clay knob, or it could be a little bottom like this, or what have you. But this leads to manganese deficiency. And typically in these higher pH soils, anywhere from a 6-8 up is when it ties up that manganese and not available to the plant. So correct that with manganese sulfate. Calcium is another big issue there with peanuts. Here's a sample I'd pulled up last year in the field there. We had a lot of pops out there. You know, the calcium level's got to be in that top 3 inches to be sufficient to fulfill these pods. It's absorbed straight through the hull. So it's very important to make good solid peanuts. We recommend you got to be greater than 500 pounds to the acre for these larger seeded peanuts. And, you got to encourage them to just have more than one sample across that whole field. That reading is only as good as the sample itself. And you got to be uniform across that field to be able to tell where you are, to be comfortable to know that you've got enough out there. And depending on what that pH level is how we're going to determine how we're going to raise that calcium level. If we've got a high pH, there's no doubt we've got to use gypsum. If the pH is lower, we can obviously use some high cal lime in the place of that. Another important element is boron. When you've got low boron, sometimes you won't have any fruiting take place, like the picture on the left that you see. They should be full of flowers down in that canopy, like what you see on the right. And the boron is important there in the development of that pollen tube right there, which in turn becomes the pen. You got a new yellow flower every day out there, and that plant that in turn takes about 3 to 5 days to get to the soil to start forming that pen and pod. But most times as we think about boron deficiency, we think about hollow heart, where you've got some hollowed out area there, discoloration inside those kernels, and then also we have the severe boron deficiency is those lateral splitting of the limbs, like in the picture you see to the right. In my 21 years working for Auburn, I've only seen that 2 times. Once was last year, and once was probably 17, 18 years ago over in Geneva County. You don't very, very seldom do you see that. Most times the soils have enough boron in the soil to provide plenty adequate boron for that plant to grow normally and not see that lateral splitting. And typically hollow heart's the main problem, but you will occasionally see that. And of course, we obviously recommend and encourage those growers to apply boron as a foliar spray because it leaches so fast in these soils. Like I said, hey, that was quick, but I didn't want to keep anybody from lunch. I know they've been sitting here a long time, and I just want to hit a few high points on important things to be looking at from agronomic side out there in the field when they're scouting these peanuts, and things that may show up there a little different to them. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Anybody got any quick peanut questions before we move on to Mr. Birdsong? All right. Take it away.
All right. Thanks, Scott. I want to say there's a lot of great information that's been provided here and presented here today. And no matter what this information has to apply to us, the weather is what's going to affect us the most. And we got something very historic to be able to hopefully that we will break a cycle this year in 2020, as all our growers are very well aware this year ends in a 0. And it appears, and we're a long ways away from being able to say that it's conclusive that we will break this cycle, but it appears that we got an opportunity to break a 40-year cycle, starting back from 1980 to 1990 to 2000 to 2010. Every year that's ended in a 0, for those of you that have been involved in agriculture, are very well aware that it's been an extensive, disastrous drought. But across the wiregrass, I'd say that the crop looks good. There are some very dry pockets around in the area. But Dr. Smith and Dr. Graham, I'm happy to report where we were at earlier this week up in Hellberg, that they did get a very good rain yesterday. And so but there are still some dry pockets around. And to quote Gene Reagan, who had a farm broadcast show right here in Southeast Alabama, he had the longest farm broadcast show in the U.S. of around 41, 42 years. I'll repeat what he said. He said, it has not rained until it's rained on your farm. So for those of you that have received the rain, say, hey, the crop looks great. We do sympathize with those who are in desperate need of a good rain. And so you're right. It hasn't rained until it's rained on your farm. Want to remind our producers, especially those with irrigation, we're going into a very critical time period right here, right now. Most of the cotton in the wiregrass area is planted between April the 25th through May the 15th. And if you fast forward 90 days, just paying attention to the physiological calendar of the cotton plant, that's going to put us around 90 days of age, will be around June the 25th through August the 15th. And that's when we're going to be hitting peak water demand. Chris has already mentioned that about the water demand chart for the peanut plant. The cotton plant's very similar to that. We'll hit peak water demand at 90 days of age. So for some of the very earliest cotton, we are reaching peak water demand. For a lot of this other cotton, we're just starting to enter that. So leading up to 2 weeks up to peak bloom to 2 weeks afterwards, we're going to be needing somewhere around 2 to 2.5 inches of rain per week. And so even though we got a very prospecting crop right now, and a lot of great potential, can't sell potential, the next 30 days is going to be critical. It's going to be crucial for us. And with that in mind, we want to look forward to what kind of forecast do we have. I spoke with David Zierden. He is the state climatologist for Florida. He's out of Tallahassee, Florida. And he comes to our Cotton Expo every year, gives us an update, talk about the La Nina cycle, we talk about the El Nino cycle and how that's going to affect us in the fall, winter, and early spring weather patterns. And I do not know as much about the forecast for the rest of the state, but I would say that the forecast he gave me this morning in respect to South Alabama, and says in the near term, we're looking at 60% chance of rain each afternoon tomorrow through next week, hoping for more penetration into Southeast Alabama than the last few days. No more impact from Tropical Storm Hannah, and that's what we've been experiencing in the very southern part of the state, and that's what helped break some of that dry spell around Hellberg, was one of those bands from Tropical Storm Hannah. Said from the long term, the no outlook and a 1 and 3 month outlook both favors above normal rainfall. The La Nina is forecasted 55% chance for the fall, but he says it looks like it's going to be falling apart to him. But the good news, and I'll leave you with this, is that no hot, dry spells in any forecast at this time. So that's very encouraging forecast. And hopefully with that forecast, we can break that 40-year trend of a disastrous drought on the years ending at 0. So we have seen a lot of the things that have been mentioned in this program in respect to low pH spots and others out there. Now's the time to identify them if you're scouting and be able to point them out to your growers. So great information today, and we pray that this weather forecast will come through and everybody will have a bumper crop this year, because we certainly need it.
All right. Well, thank you all very much. We appreciate your attendance, and good luck finishing out the crop this year. If any of us in Extension can ever help you, please reach out and let us know. Thank you.